The houses of the majestic city, like stone titans, rose above the narrow streets, forming a majestic landscape where every facade, every roof, and every stained glass arch seemed to contain an echo of bygone eras, coming to life in the reflections of the setting sun. The peasants gathered at the royal palace watched with obvious curiosity and hidden excitement as the young girl, desperately making her way through the guards, tried to shout at the top of her voice to the king, as if she wanted to tell him something that could change the fate of the entire kingdom. However, before she could approach the monarch, one of the steel-clad knights, whose hand was accustomed to punishing and subduing, without hesitation brought down his powerful blow on her, causing her to fall to the cold ground, after which he mercilessly stepped on her chest with his boot. Meanwhile, the king himself, clad in the heavy robes of power, stood majestically on a pedestal next to a beautiful girl, while the mysterious stranger, who had once posed as a princess, stood before him with her head bowed, listening to the harsh death sentence. The criminal, sprawled on the cold ground, remained motionless as sentence was passed upon her, punishing her for her audacious attempt to not only usurp someone else's name, but also to jeopardize the fragile peace between the great empire and the mages, almost igniting a feud that could lead to war. And so, when the tension in the air reached its climax, a man with a stern look raised his hand, calling for silence, and loudly declared that the treacherous deceiver Philomel, who dared to commit such a grave sin, must be immediately executed, and the death sentence will be carried out right now. The young girl standing next to the king was cowering against him, her expression fearful and wary, her fair hair framing her features, fluttering in the wind, her eyes filled with worry, clinging to her only protection, the man who held her fate in his hands. The crowd, seething with indignation, roared, filled with righteous anger, and with uncontrollable fury attacked the unfortunate woman who dared to deceive herself into the trust of the imperial family, calling her an impostor and a treacherous usurper, unworthy of mercy. The people's wrath knew no mercy. The poor woman, lying prostrate on the dusty ground, did not even have time to move when a barrage of stones fell upon her. One after another, they struck her mercilessly. Each blow was a sentence, each throw a brand, erasing her existence under the weight of the people's wrath. The sad villainess slowly raised her head. Her face, smeared with soot, seemed paler than usual, and her golden eyes, filled with pain, gleamed sadly through the shadow of her long, disheveled hair, which had recently flowed like silk. She was beautiful even now. Her father, the emperor, stood high above her, watching her with a cold, empty gaze, as if he was looking not at his own blood, but at a non-entity. His long black hair fell on his shoulders, but there was not a single movement in it, as well as in his heart, frozen in the ice of a ruler. The upset beauty, unable to restrain herself, cried out with pain in her voice that she had once truly believed that she was his daughter. But despite everything, she would not ask for mercy, because she was aware of her sins and understood that death was the only thing she deserved. But the emperor, without even flinching, merely looked away as if her words had no meaning for him, and then with cruel cold-bloodedness gave the order to bring a thread and sew up the mouth of his former daughter, this insignificant traitor, unworthy even of the right to speak. Philomel froze, stunned, her breathing ragged, and her heart seemed to stop beating for a moment. She did not expect such terrible words. Horror pierced her, sliding like a cold snake down her spine, fettering every cell of her body with the tenacious paws of despair. The crowd roared, taking up the emperor's words with fanatical delight. Hundreds of hands shot into the air, and furious voices, merging into a single roar, shouted that the ruler was infallible, and his word was a law that must be obeyed without a shadow of such doubt. Philomel bowed her head, her wide eyes filled with despair and silent supplication, but no mercy touched her. She had hoped to the last for at least a shadow of compassion from her father, but instead received a punishment far more terrible than she could have imagined. Tears slowly flowed down her thin, trembling hands, clutching the crumpled hem of her beautiful dress, drop by drop falling onto the fabric, saturating it with pain that was bursting from the depths of her heart, but found no outlet except for quiet, soundless crying. Suddenly, The ruler turned his gaze again to the criminal, whose voice, trembling with despair, broke the silence of the hall, and at that moment, as if clinging to her last hope, she dared to turn to him, putting into her words everything that had remained unsaid for years. Through stifled sobs, barely coping with the overwhelming feelings, she nevertheless decided to ask the question of the one she once called father, wanting to know whether he ever remembered her as his daughter, or all these years he saw in her only a criminal, unworthy of even a drop of his pity. But before the man could answer, he was stopped by another touch. A soft female palm gently but insistently squeezed the edge of his scarlet cloak, pulling it back a little, as if trying to protect him from unnecessary words and unnecessary memories. It was his real daughter, young, fair-haired, impeccable in her purity. She raised a pleading look to her father and imploringly whispered that he should no longer look at this terrible punishment, that they should leave and forget about the existence of this woman, unworthy of either pity or forgiveness. Without thinking twice, the man agreed without hesitation that Elencia should not have washed away her guilt with blood, and, filled with unexpected gentleness, he tenderly hugged her back, as if trying to protect her from the injustice that he himself could have committed at that moment, but did not. His eyes remained cold, not reflecting a drop of emotion, as he gave the order in a flat, dispassionate voice to immediately execute the criminal, not allowing anyone to doubt his decision and leaving no room for pity, which was never there, never appeared. Philomel, the villain of this romance, remains in the shadow of her father, watching as the man walks away with his new daughter, leaving her behind, doomed to a bad death, like an unnecessary page in a long closed chapter of his life, forgotten and alone forever. The beauty died painfully under the blade of a cruel executioner, and at the moment when her life faded away, no one even flinched. No one looked at her with sympathy, as if her existence was nothing more than a mistake, erased without a trace and forgotten forever like a bad dream. In a quiet, broken whisper, addressing the void, the beauty whispered her last words, filled with bitter prayer, hoping that at least before his death, her father would give her an answer. Did he love her at least once in his life? Or was it all just an illusion, nothing more than a mirage? Suddenly, breaking the ominous silence, a large book fell to the floor with a dull, deafening thud, causing the air to shake, as if fate itself wanted to remind her that this story was not yet over, and that new trials awaited her ahead, which no one had predicted. The lovely noblewoman angrily threw the novel away. Her gaze was full of anger, and her heart sank with resentment, because such a sad end for the main villain, like Philomel, seemed completely unfair and absurd to her, causing her soul to fill with anger. Little Philomel was angry that such an unhappy and cruel end awaited her, as if fate itself was mocking her aspirations and dreams, and at that moment she wanted to break out of those pages of the book that portrayed her so unfairly, depriving her of hope. The ceiling of the mansion, quiet and majestic, seemed lifeless, and the chandelier, like a silent witness of what was happening, hung high, not paying attention to the raging emotions below, where a small soul was torn apart by pain and anger, as if her world was collapsing irrevocably. Falling to the floor, young Philomel began to pound her fists on the wooden floor in rage, furiously expressing her anger at the book that said she was an unloved and false daughter to her father, deprived of even a drop of real love and understanding. Upset and disappointed, the noblewoman quietly muttered, as if consoling herself, that she would tell her father everything that very evening, and he would, of course, punish the author of the novel, who dared to lie and portray her in a way that she could not come to terms with. When the beauty finally calmed down, the noblewoman sat down on the floor and sighed tiredly, feeling the tension leave her body, but leaving behind a persistent feeling of stupidity and awkwardness for this whole storm of emotions, which seemed to have no sense or logic. Frowning, Philomel wondered what would happen if her nanny saw her in this state, when she had thrown a real childish tantrum, which was so uncharacteristic of her that the nanny would definitely start grumbling, pointing out her weaknesses and the lack of restraint she had shown. With a childish hand, the noblewoman picked up the book she had just dropped, with a slight trepidation, and looked carefully at the cover. It was the story of Princess Elencia, a story full of magical adventures and mysteries that promised to capture her imagination and carry her away to another world. Thoughtfully, slowly, the young lady took the large book in her hands and, looking at the pages, plunged into a world where each character hid his own secret, and the story itself was full of unexpected turns, enticing clues, and mysterious events that awaited her. It was a story about a pair of lovers, a blonde with golden eyes sparkling like the sun's rays, and a man with black hair and bright eyes like the sea, reflecting the vastness of the ocean and the deep feelings that engulfed their souls, full of passion and thirst for life. And also about the princess, who was amazingly similar to the late empress. Her facial features, demeanor, and even her gait were reminiscent of the departed queen, as if the noblewoman was her incarnation in a new time, conveying her noble grandeur and greatest strength. The little girl had already heard rumors that the throne was planned to be given not to her, the princess, but to a distant relative, who for some unclear reason was considered more suitable, despite her distant connection to the dynasty and lack of real rights to the throne, which puzzled her. The maids whispered quietly that the emperor preferred a distant relative to his own daughter, and this became increasingly obvious, although none of them dared to say it out loud, fearing anger and punishment for breaking the silence within the palace walls and rumors. Philomel screamed loudly, barely holding back her tears, as the servants took her away from her father, unable to understand why he did not even want to look in her direction, why he did not show the slightest interest in her suffering, leaving her completely alone and without any support. The emperor, her father, continued to sit silently at his huge desk, intently leafing through documents, as if he was completely unaware of her desperate cries, remaining completely indifferent to what was happening to his daughter, as if she did not exist for him at all. After that, he looked up from all the papers, calmly said that the princess should be taken away immediately, without giving her even the slightest chance to express her great feelings or get any kind of explanation, as if she was just an object for him, not worthy of attention. Frustrated, Philomel lowered her eyes and felt her face grow dull with bitterness and her chest tighten with a heavy sadness, remembering the different moments when she believed in her father's great love and care. And now all that was left in front of her was emptiness and pain. Not far from the furniture in the room, on one of the walls, hung a mirror, which, reflecting the bright light, gave the room a special atmosphere, as if it were the key to unraveling what was hidden in this room, and allowed one to see all its invisible details. Philomel stared at her reflection in the mirror for a long time, as if trying to find some similarity between herself and her father, but she could not understand whether they were so different that they could not find anything in common, even in the smallest details. The small childish hands pressed the large book tighter to her chest, as if trying to protect herself from her own thoughts and feelings, from the fact that everything around was becoming alien and distant, and even the book could become her only consolation at this moment. Upset, the little girl sighed and decided that it was all just a stupid fairy tale, not a novel about her future, full of sadness, pain, and disappointment, and that everything that happened was just a coincidence, and the similar names had nothing to do with her life and destiny. The Philomel of the novel was a cruel and evil girl who executed young maids for the slightest mistakes, showing no compassion or pity for those who served her, considering them as nothing in her cruel and self-righteous universe full of fear. Closing her eyes, the girl could not control herself, because indeed, there were moments when she punished the maids for their mistakes, but after some time, she sincerely apologized, realizing her mistake and feeling the bitterness of remorse growing in her heart. Philomel winced when the maid knocked on the door and announced that she was going to come in, and the girl urgently needed to hide the book that the noblewoman was holding in her hands, as if this object could reveal her secrets, and she was not ready for such revelations and consequences. In the corner of the room stood a large wardrobe, ideally hiding a secret place in which one could hide from the whole world, and its corners seemed to keep the most secret thoughts and desires that did not dare to break out, remaining invisible and unheard, absorbed by the fog of time. The old maid walked inside and frowned, noticing that the princess was acting strangely and suspiciously, as if she was hiding something important, not wanting to reveal her true feelings, and her gaze was full of discontent, anxiety, and misunderstanding, as if the noblewoman had noticed something. The little girl stood near the table with her hands behind her back and, smiling tensely, greeted her nanny, trying to hide her awkwardness and anxiety, as if this smile could hide everything that was happening in her soul at that moment and mask her true feelings and experiences. The stern woman folded her arms across her chest and said in an irritated tone that the princess had once again not studied and was spending her time playing games instead of concentrating on what should have been her duty, and her voice sounded full of disappointment, severity, and anger. Not hiding her indignation, slapping her hand to her forehead, the woman grumbled, wondering when young Philomel would finally grow up, as her behavior left much to be desired, and she seemed unaware of her responsibility despite everything that was happening around her. The girl silently looked at her small hands, feeling the weight of silence, and did not say a word in her defense, because she understood that no explanation of hers would change the opinion of an adult woman, and every word of hers would be perceived as an excuse. Pointing her finger upward, the nanny sternly said that the little girl had to become better and that they would try to eradicate all her bad habits, because such indecisiveness and frivolity were completely unacceptable for raising a real princess who should be an example for everyone. To herself, that her father never kept his promises, but always demanded unconditional obedience from her, as if her opinions and feelings did not matter, and her whole life was just the fulfillment of other people's demands and all expectations. Her father always looked at her with cold eyes, without expressing the slightest warmth or affection, as if the noblewoman was simply obliged to fulfill demands, and never once praised her for her achievements, only continued to make new, increasingly difficult demands, which became unbearable for her with each passing day. There was so much sadness in the girl's golden eyes, so much great loneliness that it could not be hidden behind external calm, and her gaze seemed to tell a story of unfulfilled hopes and lost love that the noblewoman so longed to receive. Upset, the nanny still grumbled, asking who this little wretch took after, since her father, the emperor, had been an example of an ideal, and she could not understand how such a family could produce such an intolerable girl, unable to understand the importance of her position. When suddenly, Philomel quietly asked the grown woman if the noblewoman was really so different from her mother, because her voice sounded full of longing and doubt, and there was sadness in these words, as if the girl was trying to find at least some consolation in her thoughts about her mother. The nurse replied rudely that the baby's mother, her name was Isabel, was a good person with an excellent memory and manners, and she always served as an example to others, and all her actions were filled with an education that Philomel could never understand or feel. Young Philomel winced when she was told that a noblewoman should be more like her late mother and finally come to her senses, as if her own self was not valuable enough, and she needed to become someone else to please everyone around her. The little girl froze in surprise, lost in her thoughts, trying to comprehend what was happening around her, and various questions flashed through her head, because everything seemed so unusual and disturbing, as if everything around had changed in an instant. After all, the long-awaited festival in honor of the founding day of the empire was soon to take place in the city, and the entire capital was absorbed in preparations for this significant event, which brought together many people from all over the state to celebrate its greatness and historical importance. On this day, according to ancient history, the state received the blessing of the powerful deity of the sun, which became the basis of its prosperity and strength. And every year, this moment was like a reminder of the greatness of their past and the power that granted prosperity to the empire. This was such an important holiday in the empire that the date of its celebration was chosen by the oracle itself, because many affairs in the state depended on this date, and if it did not coincide with the divine sign, then the people could expect trouble or punishment, which caused alarm among everyone. And the celebration had to be held when there was sunshine and not rain, because that was what ancient tradition dictated. And only on such a clear and cloudless day could one expect a real holiday filled with joy and blessings from the gods who could grant good luck. And so, when that day came, Philomel stood in amazement under the clouds, looking at the sky, feeling the cold rain, and could not understand how it happened that all the events had changed, and now everything looked completely different than the noblewoman had expected, according to all the predictions. The maid warned the young lady that if she took a few steps further, she would immediately freeze and get soaked to the skin, because the rain was very cold and unpleasant, and this could lead to serious consequences for her health and well-being. Philomel stood under the roof, looking in amazement at the rain that poured down without ceasing, and her thoughts were spinning, because the future described in the books began to come true, and everything that seemed impossible and fantastic was now becoming reality before her eyes. There, in the distance, stood her father, the handsome emperor, in his majestic attire, talking seriously about something with an advisor. His masculine face was focused, and his conversation was important and tense, as always when fateful issues were being decided. The ruler listened attentively to his interlocutor, who, with obvious concern in his voice, reported that, contrary to the oracle's predictions, everything went completely differently, and instead of clear sunshine on this important day, rainy and gloomy weather reigned, not suitable for a holiday. Clutching his head in frustration, the emperor said with obvious disappointment that apparently it was still worth postponing the holiday and the festival, because such events could not take place in such unfavorable weather, violating all the hopes and expectations of the entire empire. Young Philomel felt a cold sweat run down her back, for everything that was happening was surprisingly familiar, as if the events had already been described in an incredible novel, and now, before her, the scene was unfolding, as if the book itself predicted the future. In the novel, little Elencia was about to attend an important celebration in the empire, wearing her delicate blue dress, and her whole life seemed like a perfect picture. But in this serenity there was hidden some terrible anxiety that she could not yet comprehend. But then suddenly a heavy downpour began, and she, not knowing what to do, sat down by the window, completely absorbed in the sight of raindrops falling from the sky, forming bizarre patterns on the glass, as if nature itself had decided to give her a unique picture. Thoughtfully, Philomel lay down on her bed and began to read a novel that predicted the future. Her thoughts were captured by every word, and the noblewoman could not get rid of the feeling that these events would begin to unfold right in front of her, leading her into some confusion. The book did indeed tell the future, and dear Philomel, lying on the bright grass in thought, saw how a butterfly, like a symbol of hope and change, gently settled on its spine, creating an amazing picture, as if nature itself confirmed her predictions. Without thinking twice, Philomel rushed to run into the rain, not paying attention to the piercing cold. Her soul was full of determination and defiance. She sought to overcome any obstacles and was ready to face all trials, despite the elements of nature. The maid looked after the young mistress with surprise, watching how, despite the pouring rain and piercing cold, she quickly headed forward, as if chasing something important, not paying the slightest attention to the raindrops falling from the sky. The little girl quickly approached her father and his interlocutor, who, not noticing her approach, continued to talk, absorbed in an important conversation, not paying attention to her steps, and she felt almost invisible at that moment, like a shadow. Breathing heavily, the girl stopped, quietly calling out to her adult father. Her voice was barely audible among the noise of the rain, but the noblewoman desperately tried to attract his attention, because her request was important, and every moment seemed valuable and urgent to her. The man glanced coldly at his daughter when he heard the woman's request not to postpone the celebration. His face remained unperturbed, and there was not the slightest sign of doubt in his eyes, as if her words could not change his firm decision. The girl insisted that the party should be held today, despite the pouring rain and all the obstacles. Her determination was obvious, and the maid, hurrying after her, had difficulty keeping up with her fast pace, trying to keep up. Young Philomel, feeling she couldn't stop, begged her father to hold the festival on that very day, her voice full of urgency and excitement, and she couldn't let this moment slip away, knowing that this was her only chance in life. But the emperor, without paying the slightest attention to his daughter, turned around and silently left, as if ignoring her existence, calling after him his faithful adviser, who, as always, followed him indifferently, without showing the slightest sympathy or remorse. The princess's father's eyes sparkled with anger. He was not ready to tolerate the whims of his unloved child every day, who constantly burdened him with his presence and demanded attention, which only further fueled his irritation, fatigue, and hatred. Everyone present in the hall froze, shocked by the emperor's cruel words, which struck at the princess's pride, because for him she was just a shadow, not deserving of attention and respect, which once again showed her complete disregard and non-recognition. The little girl looked down, her face hidden by the rain that poured from the sky, relentlessly washing away her tears, and her hair became wet, clinging to her face. At that moment, the noblewoman felt her heart breaking from the pain, despair, and the other aristocrats, watching from the sidelines, were silent. Their gazes were cold and indifferent, full of indifference, as if they were looking at her as if she were a lifeless object, incapable of arousing in them either pity or compassion. However, in the distance, among the crowd, there was a young boy, about her age, with golden hair and bright red eyes, who was watching the princess closely, and, noticing her bitterness and despair, felt a deep regret. The young maid placed her hands on the beautiful mistress's back, trying to comfort her and saying softly that it would be better for them to go into the warmth now, into a cozy room where they could take shelter from the rain and not stand here, soaking wet under the relentless pouring rain. The boy, feeling an inner urge, wanted to go up and comfort the princess. His name was Nazar, and he was full of desire to go up to her and support her. But the hands of his relatives abruptly stopped him, not allowing him to do the deed to which his heart was drawn. His father, rudely interrupting his intention, said that now was not the time to go to the emperor's daughter, because it would have a bad effect on their reputation and could lead to unwanted consequences that would have long-term negative effects on the entire family. Philomel continued to stand under the cold drops of rain, absorbed in deep sadness, her face hidden under damp strands of hair, and her gaze seemed to dissolve into the endless distances, drowning in a foggy ocean of thoughts and sharp, unbearable sadness. Before finally leaving this place, Nazar turned around and glanced at her one last time, his eyes filled with tenderness and deep regret, trying to capture this moment in his soul, as if he wanted to imprint it in his memory forever, not allowing her to forget. The sky was dark and heavily overcast, without a single ray of sunshine, swallowed up by thick, lead-like clouds that seemed to personify all the hopelessness of what was happening, darkening the world and making the heart clench with immeasurable melancholy and anxious anxiety. The stick struck the girl's legs sharply, leaving behind excruciating pain and a throbbing sensation, a painful reminder that there are moments in this world when cruelty and violence come without warning, breaking lives, shattering dreams, and destroying any hope for the best. Young Philomel closed her eyes in pain, feeling the growing punishment that became stronger with each passing moment, penetrating her body and soul, leaving a deep trace of despair, hopelessness, and merciless pain that had no end. The stern nurse, with an expression of absolute determination on her face, told the princess without the slightest sympathy that they were now moving on to a harsh system of education, since otherwise she could not understand the basic discipline and responsibility that were so necessary for her growth. The other young maids, standing nearby, did not say a word, but only coldly watched what was happening, their gazes hidden behind masks of indifference and alienation, as if they were not witnesses to this painful process at all, but simply silent. As the woman, having completed her task, gathered her things and headed for the exit, she muttered to herself with bitterness and disappointment how stupid Philomel had been, never having been able to learn the important lessons they had tried to teach her while remaining in her naivety. The maids, who had been standing silently nearby and not interfering in what was happening, suddenly broke the silence and spoke up, asking the young lady to lie down, promising that they would bring her medicine and take care of her condition to ease the pain. The women's hands carefully and thoughtfully took the healing ointment out of the jars, filling the air with the pungent but familiar smell of the medicine that was supposed to relieve inflammation, ease pain, and speed up the healing process to improve the young lady's condition. The maid, carefully and gently touching the feet of the young mistress, began to heal them, tenderly saying that if she had admitted her guilt, she would not have experienced such pain, because her suffering was the result of her stubbornness and refusal to understand the essence of what was happening. Dear Philomel remained silent. The woman's gaze became empty and helpless, as if she had lost the ability to utter even one word, and in the silence that enveloped her, there was no room for explanations or justifications, only a feeling of deep emptiness. The maids glanced quietly at each other, their looks telling, each of them perhaps trying to figure out the right way to act in the current situation, unsure of how best to help without violating their own sense of duty and permissibility. With a forced smile, one of the maids carefully and gently asked the young mistress not to be upset, reminding her that the nanny was just a human whose mood changed so quickly, and perhaps she would soon change her mind and show more sympathy. The young girl, feeling the tension growing, clutched the soft sheets with her hands, trying to find some comfort in this movement, as if hoping that this gesture could keep her in this moment, as if slowing down what was happening and giving her strength. The beauty said cautiously, and with slight doubt, that they were planning to hold the festival, but only in a week, adding that it was too late and did not at all correspond to the initial expectations, causing slight disappointment and discontent in her voice. The maids, in a dry and emotionless tone, told the lady the news that the priest had lost consciousness during his service, which was an unusual and alarming event, since such a thing had never happened before, and everyone was confused and bewildered. The little girl became wary when she heard rumors that the sun god's blessing was no longer in effect in the empire, which caused her to feel anxious and deeply worried, because if it was true, such a change could significantly change the course of events in their world and life. The second maid, looking sternly at her friend, as if warning her that a noblewoman should not say such things out loud, expressed displeasure and disapproval that such conversations should not take place, especially in such an important and tense situation. The window was open, and the night filled the room with a dark silence. The stars twinkled against the cloudless sky, and the light curtain, fluttering in the wind, added to the feeling of privacy and peace, as if the whole world had disappeared outside this room, no longer existing, swallowed. Soon, Philomel was left alone in the room. Her body could not find peace, and she closed her eyes, trying to forget, but her face was still an expression of fatigue and anxiety, as if thoughts could not leave her alone, endlessly tormenting her soul and making her doubt. Slowly, with effort, she swung her legs over the side of the large bed, feeling her bare feet touch the cold floor, and despite her fatigue, her body needed movement, to warm up a little and drive away the heavy thoughts and worries accumulating inside. The noblewoman reached out to the chest of drawers, opened the drawer, and by touch found the book that had long attracted her attention, a book that promised answers to questions and could be the key to solving her future, like a mysterious guide into the unknown, full of mysteries. She grabbed the novel that predicted the future with her hands. Its pages were thin and fragile, but she couldn't tear herself away from this book, as if it was the only bridge between reality and what could become her destiny, full of unpredictable events and possible miracles. The stones glowed brightly, reflecting the warmth of the fire, which filled the room with its soft light, creating a feeling of coziness and peace, while the light smell of burning wood spread around, giving everything a special atmosphere in which time seemed to slow down. Tears began to flow from the little girl's golden eyes as she realized with a painful realization that she had never been the emperor's biological daughter, and this revelation struck her heart, leaving an inescapable pain inside and a feeling of loss like never before, paralyzing her soul. When the bright morning came, the fire in the fireplace went out, and in its place there remained only embers, dimly smoldering, reflecting the dim light and symbolizing the passing night, like the last memory of something warm and cozy that once was, but is now gone. The maid entered the room just as it was beginning to get light outside, and, shouting loudly, the older servant informed the young mistress that it was time to get up, for a new day had already begun, and her duties could not wait, despite the nanny suddenly opened the curtains, and a bright light poured in through the window, blinding her. She told the little girl in a commanding tone that it was time to get up and start a new day, because the matter did not tolerate delay, and she had no time for rest or delay, despite her weakness. But Philomel did not react to her words in any way, silently lay in bed, breathing heavily, as if every movement required incredible effort from her, and she could not find the strength in herself to rise. Absorbed, barely opening her eyes, the girl quietly whispered that she was very ill and could not get out of bed, feeling dizzy and weak, as if her body was completely exhausted, and any attempts to get up were too difficult for her, leaving her incomplete. The maid, however, did not believe her words, thinking that Philomel was again feigning illness in order to spend another day in bed, shirking her duties, and she looked at the girl with doubt, not daring to help her, being sure of her trick, which only masked. The woman rudely noted that it was not worth skipping various classes, but then fell silent, realizing that the little girl really did have a fever, and that her words would not help, because the illness was real, and not just another trick, as she initially thought. The girl closed her eyes again. Her cheeks were burning, and hot steam was coming out of her mouth, as if her body could not cope with the high temperature, and she felt more and more helpless, losing strength, plunging into a dusty, heavy fog that obscured her consciousness. The dream of the guillotine once again took possession of her thoughts. Bloody images flashed before her eyes, and the blade fell from above, ready to cut her fate, and all the noblewoman could feel was the horror of the inevitable, consuming her consciousness, as if death itself was already following. Then Philomel, in agony of fear and pain, screamed, calling for her stern father, because she only wanted his love and understanding, to feel protected and needed. But all her requests remained unheard, swallowed up by a soulless emptiness. The cruel emperor was silent and unyielding. His cruelty was cold and merciless, like steel, not yielding to either pitiful pleas or tears. He remained a dark figure that was impossible to penetrate, leaving her in complete despair. With tears in her eyes, Philomel watched her father go, her heart aching with bitterness, realizing that her death was approaching with every moment, and he didn't care at all, as if her suffering and the last moments of her life had absolutely no meaning for him. Suddenly, as if in a nightmare, young Philomel opened her eyes sharply. Her body instantly tensed, and her hands clutched the blanket in panic, trying to find at least some support, but not finding it in this chaos that engulfed her consciousness. She was breathing heavily. Hot steam was coming out of her mouth, as if her body could not cope with the internal heat and illness, and every breath became a real test for her, and the air seemed scorching and difficult to breathe, leaving her completely exhausted. The window was open. The bright day and the view of the garden seemed so distant and alien, as if the world outside no longer had any meaning to her, and life itself, which had once seemed bright and full, was now invisible, as if everything was disappearing into the— Suddenly, the little girl sat up abruptly, mentally realizing how long she had slept, and looking around, she noticed that there was food on the table, which of course caught her attention, making her feel like time was slipping away with no hope of returning, leaving her. Her adult nanny only left the food on the table, muttering quietly that since the girl was awake, she should eat and then make an important decision about what to do next, because she needed to come to her senses after a long sleep, restore her strength, and the little girl sat on the big bed, alone, sadly, not knowing what to do, feeling emptiness and longing in her heart, which did not disappear despite the fact that she was surrounded by care and caring hands ready to support her, but could not heal this pain. After that, the noblewoman fell back onto the sheets abruptly, without any strength, as if her body could not cope with this world, and her gaze froze at the ceiling, where her thoughts were enveloped in the festival that was about to take place. But there was no joy in it, only anxiety. Philomel turned sharply on the large pillow, her mind struggling with the nightmare she had dreamed. She tried to understand what it was, but the memories remained hazy, full of fear and doubt, as if these images haunted her even in real life. Her father never spoke kind words to her, and in the future, he ordered her, standing before him in her fear, to sew her mouth with threads, ordering her to be punished for everything the noblewoman had done, leaving her no chance for forgiveness or salvation, depriving her of hope for the best. Unable to lie down any longer, young Philomel struggled to get up from the soft bed and sat up abruptly, her body heavy as if every corner of her being protested against this movement. But she had to find the strength to somehow cope with the growing. The brutal truth finally hit her like a heavy blow, like the tip of a knife cutting through her soul. Her father, the very man who was supposed to protect her, was going to kill her, and everything she had hoped and dreamed of was gone, leaving only a cold emptiness. With her knees tucked under her, Philomel sadly hoped that the future could still change, that perhaps everything was not lost yet, and that she could find a way out of this hopeless situation. But a shadow of doubt settled in her heart, frightening in its hopelessness. As the noblewoman tried to get up and go to her father to ask him if he was really capable of killing his own daughter, or at least if he loved her, the world around her suddenly began to stagger, and everything swam before her eyes, as if in delirium. The long white corridors of the mansion, seemingly endless, with many doors standing in her way, seemed to symbolize everything she had to go through to find at least some truth. But every step was given to her with incredible difficulty, as if with heat in her body and dizziness. Philomel stood up with difficulty. Her legs were wobbly, and she barely resisted the urge to fall, moving through the house in search of her father, thick steam pouring from her breath, and her cheeks were bright red from the heat, which was. With her hand clutching the cold wall, the noblewoman tried not to fall, keeping herself on her feet, and with every step her body seemed as heavy as a stone, and the thought that she had to keep going, despite the pain and weakness, did not allow her to give up. She could not allow her. Slowly but surely moving forward, Philomel staggered, trying to keep her balance despite the fact that her health was on the edge, and her heart was pounding wildly, and her consciousness was foggy, but she could not stop. Too much depended on this step. Suddenly, the noblewoman noticed conversations coming from the back of the house, nearby, but she could not make out the words that sounded through the half-open door. They were difficult to catch, but something in these words attracted her attention. Voices coming from behind the closed door, right in front of her, broke the silence, and feeling a growing sense of unease, sweet Philomel felt her heart squeeze, and her gaze was fixed on that very door, trying to understand what was happening inside. The little girl, becoming more and more anxious with each step, slowly approached the opening and, carefully pressing herself against the wall, began to listen to the conversation of the young maids who spent the night in the next room. Their whispers and intonations. In complete shock and unable to believe what she was hearing, the girl stood frozen as she listened to the complaints of the maids, who expressed their disappointment, not wanting to endure any more suffering because of the stupid princess. The pink-haired maid tried to calm her friend down, quietly telling her not to worry, as their conversation would most likely go unheard, and they shouldn't worry about the possible consequences, as they were safe in this silence. The servants, not hiding their disappointment and resentment, quietly discussed their hard lot, blaming the princess, because of whom they had to endure many difficulties, because their wages were significantly reduced, and now they felt helpless and forgotten. Young Philomel, standing in shock and unable to tear herself away from the wall, listened intently, gradually realizing that, it seemed, everyone hated her. Even the servants with whom she once felt part of this world now did not hide their contempt. Even the good knight who had once protected her now complained that all the problems he had faced were merely a consequence of her presence in his life. And despite all his devotion, he could not help but feel a sense of disappointment now. The maids, who had previously been so kind and attentive to her, began to besiege her with complaints, and sweet Philomel realized that all their words were false, that they hid their real hostility under a mask of politeness and submission. Suddenly, one of the maids sneered mockingly, her face twisted into a malicious smile as she openly stated that she actually hated the young Princess Philomel, revealing the true essence of her feelings hidden beneath the false kind words. The little princess, stunned by such cruel words, froze in shock. Her heart sank in surprise and pain. How was it possible that those she thought were close and trusted actually harbored such great hatred and anger? Rumors began to arise before the princess's eyes, and while she was being discussed, she heard mocking whispers that she did not have divine power, that the noblewoman was just an ordinary girl, no different from the common people in the imperial family. Philomel, overcome with panic, instinctively covered her mouth with her hands, trying not to make a single sound, realizing that if she said anything, her inner turmoil would become obvious, and her true inner state would immediately be revealed to those around her. Her bare feet slid across the cold floor, feeling its icy surface, leaving behind barely noticeable traces, as if the very silence of this place absorbed all sounds, and the princess, like a ghost, dissolved into the unable to bear this excruciating emotional tension. She suddenly rushed into flight, trying to take each step as quietly as possible so as not to attract unnecessary attention, because at that moment she needed only one thing: to escape from the danger. The little girl, barely holding back her growing hysteria, felt like her life was literally hanging by a thread, because every step she took now depended on the decision of her ruthless father, whose power and cruelty were unlimited, and her fate was decided in. The window looked out onto a courtyard engulfed in darkness, where an anxious silence reigned, broken only by the echoes of the servants' footsteps, as if everything around had frozen in tense anticipation of something terrible, inevitable, and tragic that was about to happen. A handsome, gray-haired advisor, with a slight smile on his face, stood before the emperor, with his hands folded and an imperturbable expression on his face, waiting for an answer, knowing full well that his words always carried weight, and everyone around him depended on. When the nobleman finally spoke, the ruler of the empire interrupted him, sharply noting that Pollen was being overly persistent and his questions were inappropriate, distracting from more important matters of state that, in the ruler's opinion, required immediate attention and urgent resolution. A man with cold, almost emotionless gray eyes quietly asked the emperor if it was bad to visit the princess who was ill, if such a simple gesture of care and attention would be too difficult for him, since he was sincerely worried about her condition. The ruler, wearily signing another document, indifferently replied that his daughter was probably pretending again, but the advisor insistently objected, emphasizing that the doctor confirmed that the girl was indeed ill, and her condition required immediate attention. The handsome man's hand froze for a moment, and he, without hiding his obvious indifference, replied that all this was absolutely indifferent to him, since he did not feel an obligation to worry about other people's problems, especially about the princess's illness. The advisor stood there awkwardly, not knowing what to say, because usually parents were always worried about their children, and in his mind it was completely natural. But here everything was different, and he couldn't understand why such a simple question was causing such strange and. As soon as he opened his mouth to speak to the ruler, his question sounded sharp as a knife, as he asked in surprise why he was so cold and indifferent to his only daughter, not showing the slightest feeling of affection and care for her, despite her important position. The ruler, with an expression of stony imperturbability, looked away, barely concealing his indifference, and with an icy, almost lifeless intonation, said that he never considered the princess his daughter, but perceived her as something distant, alien, and not belonging to his. When the conversation turned to the topic of the princess causing his wife's death, the ruler could not contain his rage, and furiously slamming his fist on the table, his face hardened, and his anger finally broke through his cold shell, eating away at all patience. Rudely and decisively interrupting his speech, the ruler ordered the servant boy to be silent. His voice was full of power and threat, as if every word was a hard blow that was supposed to immediately subdue the interlocutor and force him to remain silent, unable to object. The young man with gray hair, feeling the full weight of the situation, bowed to the ground, apologizing for his frankness, but his words were full of sincere regret, realizing that he had violated the invisible boundary of respect and submission. The emperor explained that he had previously blamed his daughter for her mother's death, but now, after some time, he no longer felt anything towards her except indifference and cold detachment, as if she were only a reminder of a past he preferred not to remember. The pen was thrown down on the documents, where at the end of the line the signature was weakly applied in ink, leaving obvious traces of carelessness and fatigue, as if the ruler himself did not believe in what he was deciding, and did not find the strength to complete this long, painful. The disappointed ruler of the empire muttered through his teeth that his daughter had behaved extremely stupidly, constantly demonstrating only failures and weakness as an heir, not living up to even his most basic expectations, which only caused disappointment and bitterness in him. The advisor, realizing the hopelessness of the situation, insistently objected that the princess was only 9 years old, and that much could not be expected of her since she was still a child, completely incapable of coping with those enormous. Taking a bottle of wine in his hand, the man said that at his age, the age his daughter was, he had already fought with his own blood brothers for the throne, understanding that fate and power require cruelty, determination, and a willingness to. Watching as the drink slowly filled the glass, the advisor quietly muttered that the emperor was simply talented from a very young age. His ability for manipulation, political play, and the desire for power manifested itself even in his teens, which allowed. The emperor looked down wearily and, with noticeable melancholy in his voice, said that his daughter was not like him or his ex-wife, and perhaps this was the reason for all her weaknesses, mistakes, and shortcomings, which he himself, perhaps, could not correct. All this time, Philomel, hiding behind the door, stood quietly and listened to the conversation of her stern father, her heart contracting with every word, because the noblewoman felt that her life, her fate, and her future were determined by these cold, cruel. A frustrated Pollen asked in surprise if the ruler really did not feel a drop of love for his daughter, because it seemed completely impossible, especially for a father who should have been at least a little worried about her fate and well-being, despite everything. To which the brunette, standing with his back turned, responded with agreement, as if it was obvious that in the relationship between the emperor and his daughter, there had long been nothing resembling true love, only emptiness and coldness, as if there was. The red liquid in the glass slowly poured, creating dark waves that reflected the very atmosphere where every word spoken by the ruler felt heavy, like a stone that invisibly sank into the depths of the soul, leaving behind painful traces. The emperor admitted that he had expected only one thing from his daughter, that she would resign herself and continue to live quietly, like a lifeless mouse, without creating any problems or disturbing the fragile order that he had so carefully built. But instead, she only disappointed him. His face was cold as he said that he didn't want the princess to be noticed, as if her existence didn't matter to the empire and its future, and all he wanted was for her to remain in the shadows, forgotten and ignored. When he finished speaking, there was no one behind the door, and Philomel left quietly, without giving away her presence. Her steps were light, but filled with a heavy heart, as if she was trying to escape from the cruel truth, hiding her deep fear and unbearable pain. Philomel lay face down on the pillow, silently clutching its edges, trying to hide her tears and the fear that was squeezing her chest, because she was well aware that her fate had already been decided, and her father, devoid of any pity, would never spare her, no matter how hard she tried. She cried quietly, wondering what she should do, because in the future, her father, full of cruelty and rudeness, would not stop at getting rid of her, because she was already just an unwanted burden for him, which, in his opinion, needed to be eliminated. The emperor was a cruel man without mercy, and no one could understand how heartless he could be, hiding behind his power and cold gaze and incredible insensitivity, an inability to show even a drop of compassion or humanity. And there was no one to ask for help, because everyone who had once been close to her had betrayed her, refusing to support her and abandoning her at the most difficult moment, leaving her alone with her own experiences and fears in this ruthless reality where there was neither support nor consolation. The little girl, overcome with hopeless despair and unbearable pain, screamed into the pink fabric, unable to hold back her sobs and inner scream, and her voice sounded so deep with sadness and fear that she could not even imagine how to live on if fate had already. At that moment, when silence enveloped her, the book opened by itself. Its ancient pages rustled, as if something had awakened, and before her opened an incomprehensible secret, hidden behind centuries, ready to be revealed only to the one who dared to look at its ancient pages. Philomel, with trembling, slightly numb fingers, slid along the lines of the ancient book, desperately searching for even the slightest clue, any hint that could help her save herself, survive in a world where her existence had no meaning, no value, no protectors. In the novel, Philomel did not die immediately after being cruelly accused of deception and called a false princess, because at that fateful moment, her new sister, moved by pity, compassion, and a sense of duty, begged for mercy, which temporarily saved the girl and delayed her inevitable tragic end. However, even this chance turned out to be illusory, a ghostly hope for salvation, because soon after that she was still roughly seized, shackled in heavy chains, and thrown into a damp, dank dungeon, behind icy bars, where she had to endure not only loneliness. The girl quickly realized the terrifying, icy truth. If Philomel were to fall into enemy hands a second time, no one would listen to excuses. No one would allow her to beg for forgiveness. She would simply be executed without trial, without hope, with a cruel sentence that could not. The little girl froze, silently reading the lines, feeling a chill run down her skin, panic rising inside, trying to understand whether it was possible to change fate, whether it was possible to avoid what was predestined, or whether her future had long been carved in stone. Finally, a truly brilliant thought flashed into her mind, so unexpected and stunning that her eyes widened in amazement, and her eyebrows reflexively moved toward the bridge of her nose, giving her face an expression of deep concentration and a premonition of an important discovery. She should have simply disappeared long before Elencia, the main character of that very book, appeared on the scene, because her presence here threatened to turn into a real catastrophe, turning the course of events written about in ancient prophecies. Among the priceless relics that adorned the royal chambers, a special place was occupied by an exquisite ring with a scarlet, like a blazing sun, ruby, passed down from generation to generation in the imperial family, and bearing the proud name, the Ring of Recognition. Only those in whose veins flowed the noble blood of the ruling dynasty were allowed to even touch these secret artifacts, because the magical decorations recognized only their true owners, unmistakably recognizing in them the heirs of the great and ancient family. In addition to protective charms and special properties, the Great Ring of Recognition granted its owner the incredible ability to instantly move through space, leaving behind only a slight flicker of magical energy, like the reflect. Determinedly, clenching her hand into a fist in front of her, the sweet little girl felt how the ring on her finger could be her last chance for salvation, if only she could pull it out and use this precious moment to escape before it was too late. Slowly, with effort, she began to rise, trying to put her weakened legs on the floor, feeling how her tired body resisted every movement, as if every step was given to her with great difficulty and pain in her joints. But she still did not give up. But suddenly, the world around her suddenly swayed, and the fireplace standing in the corner began to seem closer and closer, as if it was approaching her with every second, and her head was instantly covered with a dark veil, as if everything around her. Philomel, unable to keep her balance, suddenly collapsed to the floor, her long hair unraveling and spreading across the carpet, and her entire body, as if in slow motion, frozen in one moment when reality seemed to disappear from under her feet, and she could do nothing to stop her fall. The girl felt acutely how the memories of her illness, her agonizing illness, were taking hold of her, leaving her strength running out, and she could not even get up, feeling a heaviness throughout her body, as if there was no longer any hope for salvation or support. Her room was full of expensive furniture, and the one window that looked out onto the dark evening sky seemed to cast cool shadows into the air, creating a feeling of stillness and silence, as if the world outside the room had disappeared. Swallowed up, clenching her hands into fists, she began to rise despite her weakness, not intending to give in and let herself die. The noblewoman knew that she could not allow herself to lose the fight against herself, even when her strength was running out and her body refused to obey, and fear began to creep up. Gathering her last strength, the sweet lady, with determination in her eyes, convinced herself that she had to survive. Her face was stern and focused, reflecting the inner strength that was flaring up in her soul, despite all the pain and fatigue, despite all the obstacles. Soon it was night and shadows filled the room, and the only source of light, the dim light coming through the window, barely illuminated her determined face, full of determination and fortitude that did not allow her to give up at that moment, despite everything that was happening. The door swung open quietly, with a barely audible creak, and a soft, warm light burst into the dark, slightly dusty room, flooding every corner, filling the space with comfort and peace, as if inviting you into a new world where light and deep silence reign. The emperor, without uttering a single word, entered his daughter's room with dignity. His steps were light and confident, and his gaze was impenetrable. He did not need words to convey the full depth of his thoughts and his immutable intentions. The young maid, carefully holding a lighted candle in her hands, followed the ruler, barely stepping on the soft carpet, and, bending down, quietly suggested to him that she wake the princess so that she could meet him properly and according to all the accepted rules. But the ruler, restraining his inner impulse and suppressing his desire, refused to enter, and the nanny, having quietly waited at the door, remained standing outside the threshold, holding an old candle in her hands, the light of which barely illuminated the dark, impenetrable shadow. At this time, Philomel, exhausted by a long illness, was sleeping quietly in her bed, her face so pale that it seemed almost transparent, and her breathing shallow and intermittent, as if even sleep had become an ordeal for her weakened body, consumed by illness. The man clutched his head in confusion and froze in thought, wondering what stupid thing he had just done, going into her room in the middle of the night to check on his unloved daughter, while she had probably long needed the peace and care he had not provided her with. Frustrated and upset, he blamed everything on his advisor, who had once insistently suggested that he check the princess's condition, because it was he who had said that the princess could become seriously ill. But, alas, he did not listen to his warning. Suddenly, unable to bear it any longer, he reached out his hand to his little girl, but immediately froze, noticing that she was crying in her sleep. Her small body was shaking convulsively, and her face was distorted with fear, as if she was experiencing something incredibly terrible and painful that did. Philomel, without waking up, continued to cry in her sleep. Her weak but desperate voice sounded like a silent request for protection, as if she was looking for her father to come and save her. She was clearly having a terrible nightmare, and in this night terror, she was completely alone and helpless. The man, completely confused and stunned by what he heard, froze in place, unable to understand how the girl could remember with such horror her nightmare, in which the noblewoman desperately begged her father not to kill her, and this shook him to the depths of his soul. Young Philomel, trembling more and more with fear every minute, and finding no peace, cowered in bed, unable to calm down, continued to beg for mercy. Her voice sounded almost inarticulate from horror, and her heart beat loudly. The emperor, shocked by the unexpected discovery, awkwardly recoiled, as if he had recoiled from something unbearably terrible. His eyes widened in shock and surprise, and he could not believe it, remaining in complete confusion and bewilderment at what was happening. He remembered his childhood, when, just like now, he trembled in bed, not understanding why everyone hated him and wanted him dead, and this painful uncertainty took hold of him again, causing deep pain and despair in his heart, filling his. The memories flooded the man with such force that he literally froze in place. His gaze became empty and helpless, and his face reflected indescribable pain, as if he was reliving those terrible moments that tormented his soul. The sweet girl lay quietly in bed, not awake, her breathing even and calm, and she seemed so defenseless, unaware of what was happening around her, unaware of what might be beyond her sleep, in a world full of threats and unknown dangers. Her fingers, as if in a fit of desperate desire, tightly squeezed her father's hand in her sleep, as if in this short moment she was trying to find at least some protection and confidence that he was near, despite everything that could happen. Even if she herself did not. Upset, Dad felt the threads of memories entangling his head again. He remembered how he himself had once been so forgotten and unloved by anyone, and everyone around him hated him, leaving him alone, and these painful thoughts now tormented him. Suddenly, his daughter's requests came back to him, and an alarming thought flashed through his mind. What if her words were not just childish whims, but real signs that she was suffering, that she was trying to convey something important to him, but he did not pay attention to it? Crying in her bed, the baby did not at all resemble the happy princess, the emperor's daughter, whom everyone considered innocent and carefree. Her face was distorted with pain and fear, and her quiet cry, like an invisible pain, tore. The ruler of the empire wondered if he really had paid so little attention to his young daughter, because now he began to understand how much the noblewoman needed his support, his love and care, which she seemed to never receive or feel. Throwing off all the restless thoughts that tormented his mind and gave him no peace, the man stood up on his feet, and with each step, overcoming the inner heaviness that was pulling his tender soul into the abyss, he began to feel how strength gradually returned. The golden apple, with its bright and pure shine, sparkling like a small sun, attracted attention with its beauty and grandeur, which seemed so unexpected and magical that it left no room for doubts or various questions. The girl, with surprise in her eyes, slowly stared at the gift that was given to her in the morning, not believing that it was really hers, that it was not a dream, and, doubting her luck, with obvious bewilderment, she continued to carefully examine the gift. The displeased young princess asked if the emperor, her father, had really given her this gift, and the nurse answered with a tinge of sympathy in her voice, sighing with disappointment, as if the heaviness of her soul could not be hidden, and there remained pain in her heart. The woman, sullenly but with obvious interest, asked what had happened yesterday that had so suddenly and drastically changed the behavior of the man, who had previously shown only cruelty and indifference, and now, as if by magic, began to show mercy and care for his daughter, which seemed. The little girl replied that nothing serious had happened, and turning away, the lady, with a slight sigh, told the girl not to take her words too much to heart, as if they were simply empty and had no real meaning for her. Philomel tilted her head to the side in surprise, thinking about how this was the fruit of a heavy and rare tree that was incredibly difficult to obtain. However, despite all the difficulties, this fruit had some amazing power that made it truly valuable. And the fruits of this tree had incredible powers, capable of instant healing, due to their magical nature, bestowing health and strength to those lucky enough to touch them, as if they themselves were the embodiment of magic. Holding the golden apple in her hands, Philomel carefully examined it from all sides, as if trying to unravel its secret. Every detail of this unusual gift, its mysterious nature and hidden power, excited her, giving her no rest, and she could not tear her eyes away from this magical fruit. After much thought, as if hearing the voice of her soul, Philomel, succumbing to an inner impulse, asked to convey her gratitude to her father, and then, not without a slight sadness in her voice, asked to remove the fruit from her hands, as if this gift had become too heavy for her. The nurse was deeply surprised by the sweet girl's answer, and, with evident perplexity, asked if the princess was not hiding something important, whether this was all she wanted to say, as if doubting whether she had not omitted something that she could understand, and that had special significance. The maid took the golden apple into her hands with complete obedience, without haste, as if this fruit was something much more valuable than just a gift, and required the same careful and reverent attitude as a precious and fragile artifact. After a short pause filled with thought, the nanny quietly said that the rich Master Averden had asked the young princess for a meeting, conveying it as something ordinary. But there was something hidden in her words that made the girl wary and feel anxious, in shock, unable to believe her ears, and, hearing the nanny's words that Mr. Averden was interested in when it would be possible to visit the young lady, her face expressed complete surprise, and her eyes were filled with confusion and fear. In silence, the little girl lowered her head and fell silent, not knowing what to answer, as if her thoughts were occupied with something important and complex. But the noblewoman could not find the right words to express her confusion, anxiety, and excitement. After a short thought, when the doubts subsided a little and clarity came to her, she finally answered that it would be possible to invite the guy today, afternoon, as if the decision had come to her unexpectedly. But it seemed right and justified, giving a certain meaning. The blue sky flowed seamlessly into the majestic towers, and the roof of the mansion was painted a deep blue, giving the whole appearance an air of mystery and enigma, as if every element was part of a carefully thought out. The princess dressed carefully for the upcoming meeting, choosing an outfit that emphasized her status and inner strength, and listened to the conversations of the other guests, among whom one voice insistently insisted that the interlocutor named Nazar calm down and stop sulking, despite all the worries. The girl followed the maid, gradually realizing that the Duke's entire family had come to visit them, and her heart filled with excitement, because such an important meeting could not take place without her participation, which meant that she had to be ready to meet the guests and make a good impression on them. The little girl reassured the maid, saying that she could handle it herself, that she didn't need help, and that she shouldn't have gone with her, assuring her that despite her inexperience, the noblewoman could handle this challenge, because at such moments it was important to be. Philomel stood awkwardly in the hallway, silently counting the numbers, trying to collect her thoughts, preparing to enter the room where the guests were already waiting, and trying to concentrate to avoid awkwardness, not to get confused in front of everyone who was in this. The green shoes on the princess emphasized her sophistication and elegance, giving her image sophistication, and she gathered all her courage, took a step, entered the hall, feeling how her steps echoed in this spacious room, full of important guests, who were impatient. There, in the depths of the room, an adult aristocrat with dazzling golden hair and eyes as deep as a boundless ocean, which looked at her with mild interest, was already waiting for her, and next to her stood a boy about her age with red eyes that gave his face an unusual. Smiling politely, the princess greeted the Duke and his son, a young boy named Nazar, with warmth and respect, as if each of them were an important and honored guest in her palace, and her gaze was full of goodwill and sincere attention to each one. The young men also greeted the girl politely. The man, deep in thought, bowed slightly as a sign of respect, and the boy, rising from his seat, looked at her with curiosity and sincere interest, carefully observing her movements. The young man, with a visible look of worry on his face, expressed his concern over how much he was worried when he learned that the princess had fallen ill, sincerely wishing that she would recover as soon as possible and return to her important duties and responsibilities with a slight smile. Young Philomel, with a soft and caring voice, said that she had almost completely recovered, despite all the worries and difficulties she had faced recently, thanks to the constant support of those around her and her own willpower. There was a beautiful cup of aromatic tea on the table, its haze floating in the air, creating a calming atmosphere, filling the room with warmth and comfort, as if inviting everyone present to rest, peace, and pleasant communication at this wonderful moment. The Duke soon left, citing important matters, and a couple of percent remained in the hall alone, immersed in silence, where everyone felt a certain foggy atmosphere that filled the space, leaving a trace in their thoughts and instilling a feeling of uncertainty. Before leaving, the Duke turned around and gently asked his son to take care of the future heir to the throne, as if passing on an important duty and responsibility that he would have to accept in the future, consider and fulfill with honor and dignity. The boy, understanding his father's hint, bowed his head respectfully and, slightly embarrassed, agreed with his words, promising that he would fulfill the request, saying goodbye to him and feeling all the weight and seriousness of the moment, which turned out to be significant, important, and completely unforgettable. The girl looked at the boy in front of her and, remembering their past, realized that she knew much more about him than she would have thought, feeling a certain warmth that awakened memories of a future that they could share together, despite everything. Nazar was her future groom, a kind, sincere, and sweet young man with whom the noblewoman could go through all the trials of life. And although their path was just beginning, the girl already felt that this was an important and long away. When asked if she was okay, Philomel smiled and responded with a slight sense of relief, confidently saying that yes, despite all the worries and anxieties, she felt well enough and was ready to move forward despite the difficulties and uncertainty. The child's gloved hands were clasped on her knees, and her green dress lay neatly, as if emphasizing the innocence and youth that she personified, sitting quietly and modestly in this moment, immersed in her thoughts, which were full of dreams for the future. A conversation began between the couple. The princess suggested that the guy go on a picnic soon, when she would recover a little and feel better, and the young man happily agreed, imagining this moment as a special time for them, where they could be together, enjoying nature. Taking a cup of tea in her hand, Philomel thoughtfully looked at the window and, smiling, began to say that, despite her wishes, the weather was not particularly conducive to a picnic, since the cool wind and fog did not contribute to a pleasant time spent outside, creating an atmosphere of coziness and peace in the hall. The boy, smiling, politely agreed with the girl, feeling the lightness and sincerity in her proposal. His face lit up with a kind smile, which concealed genuine respect and attention to her opinion, and, perhaps, even slight admiration for her prudence and kindness. Slowly but surely, Philomel led him to the idea that a picnic should be held not outdoors, but indoors, where one could enjoy the warmth and comfort, and where the weather would not interfere with a pleasant pastime, providing comfort and peace. Without thinking twice, the young man agreed with her, nodding in approval, realizing that this decision would be the most convenient for everyone, especially considering the changeable weather, which could bring unnecessary inconvenience and anxiety, disrupting the atmosphere of their plans. The cup was carefully placed back on the saucer, and Philomel, smiling, began to talk about the famous pianist who had recently become increasingly talked about in high society, discussing his unusual achievements and refined playing style, which was mesmerizing. And again Nazar, with slight interest, agreed with her, nodding and expressing his admiration, because the conversation touched on one of the topics that was also close and fascinating to him, forcing him to mentally immerse himself in the world of music, magic, and depth, which always evoked in him a special feeling of admiration. In the original, the boy spent time with a real princess, not a fake one. The two of them sat in a clearing, enjoying each other's company, and chatted sweetly, creating an atmosphere of comfort and mutual understanding where lightness, sincerity, and warmth reigned. Frustrated, Philomel hung her head, for she was a fake after all, and the realization of this awakened heavy feelings in her heart, making her question her own role in this world, her place in the lives of others, and the fact that her true self was hidden. And then Nazar froze in surprise. Hearing the princess's refusal, his face immediately turned pale, and his thoughts became confused, as if he could not understand what exactly had happened and why his expected conversation had suddenly turned so sharply against him, leaving him at a loss. The princess suddenly stood up from her seat, her eyes became serious, and she told the boy to forget their conversation, as if driving him out of her world and making him understand that the noblewoman did not want to continue this conversation in such a tone, which, in her opinion, was too close. After which the girl, smiling but with a strained expression on her face, told the boy that he shouldn't come here so often. He shouldn't play the role of a gentleman with her, because in fact, he had no right to interfere in her life, creating false expectations and trying to control her choices. Nazar jumped up in surprise when he heard her say that he shouldn't have pretended to be friendly and pretended to be more than he actually was, feeling that his actions were perceived in a completely different way than he expected, which ultimately put him in an awkward position. The young man, embarrassed, asked for forgiveness if he had accidentally hurt her feelings with his earlier words, realizing that he might have entered her space too much, not realizing how unpleasant it could be for her and creating unintentional tension. Philomel interrupted him, saying that perhaps she should have made other friends besides him instead of wasting his time, since she herself did not understand why they should continue their conversation, which only led to unnecessary tension, growing awkwardness and confusion in their feelings. After which the princess turned sharply and walked away from the young man. Her steps were confident, and her gaze was cold and distant, leaving him in complete bewilderment and confusion, which only intensified the feeling of loneliness that suddenly overwhelmed him, giving him no peace and making his heart beat faster from bitterness. Nazar stood there, confused, his eyes dull, his heart aching with sadness, and it seemed as if the whole world around him had become dim, because he still didn't understand what exactly had gone wrong, why his presence had become a heavy burden for her, a heavy load that she didn't want to bear. The door opened and slammed behind her, leaving a deep silence in the room that was filled with loneliness and uncertainty, as if the world had suddenly turned away from him and he was left alone, in his unresolved sadness and deep disappointment, unable to comprehend what had happened. Philomel walked away down the white corridor, without looking back or showing any regrets. Her steps were firm and decisive, as if she had decided to finally end this moment, leaving everything behind, as if she had deliberately chosen a path free of attachments and unnecessary worries. The girl slapped her hand loudly on the book, as if to emphasize the completion of her task, and perhaps trying to throw off all the tense atmosphere that reigned around her, as if trying to free herself from the doubts and emotions that seemed to have overwhelmed her in the last minutes. Her teacher was shocked at how quickly Philomel finished reading the large volume, which would have taken most students considerably longer, but she took it as a sign of incredible concentration and mental effort that would have surprised any teacher. Adjusting her glasses on the bridge of her nose, the woman was impressed by her student, as such a quick mastery of complex material was rare even among the most gifted students, and she could not help but notice how her student was showing her unique strength in her studies, admiring her attention to detail. The girl also quickly and correctly passed the test on the subject, demonstrating exceptional intelligence and the ability to accurately answer questions, which could not fail to please her teachers and led to her receiving a high score, which was higher than most other students. Philomel has clearly changed and become completely different. Her behavior and attitude towards her studies have become much more serious, and her look has become more confident and determined, as if she herself realized that the time has come to change and become a better version of herself, not only for others, but also for herself. Such news that the princess had become a better version of herself spread throughout the palace and the empire, causing surprise and admiration among the courtiers and servants, because no one expected such a quick and strong change that could have such a strong impact on her personality and daily life. The tired teacher fell into a chair. His eyes were closed from fatigue, and his thoughts had long since wandered somewhere far away, as he was tired of the eternal questions of the princess, who seemed unwilling to stop and continued asking questions, despite the teacher's obvious concern. With a sweet smile that barely hid her determination, Philomel folded her hands in front of her, saying the words that everyone should mind their own business and not bother those around them with idle talk, as if that was the most obvious and important thing she could say. After which, sitting at the table in the company of the Duke's son, she completely ignored the young man, as if he were nothing more than an empty background, and, without giving him a single glance, continued to delve into the book, absorbed in its pages, as if the whole world except her had ceased to exist. Young Nazar froze awkwardly when he heard the beautiful princess call his name. His heart skipped a beat, and his mind instantly went into a state of confusion, because he did not expect the noblewoman to address him so unexpectedly and directly. When Philomel suddenly asked her companion a question, inquiring about the exact date of the great battle of Celia, her gaze was focused and attentive, and her voice was calm and indifferent, as if this information had special significance for her and was important for her purposes. After hearing the exact year of the battle's origin, the girl thanked him for his answer, her words sounding sincere and polite, as if she truly valued his knowledge and attention to her request, although her expression remained calm and hidden, with no signs of emotion. The young man silently accepted the compliment, knowing that his answer was accurate and appropriate, but his eyes were modest and his face remained impassive, hiding the inner thoughts and emotions that he did not want to show the princess, trying to remain neutral. Looking at her return gaze, Nazar thought that perhaps the princess was somehow secretive about him. Perhaps she had some hidden reason or purpose for paying attention to him, even though she didn't say it directly, which made him even more puzzled. He sat quietly, lost in his thoughts, unable to understand what had caused the heaviness in his soul, as if an invisible weight was pressing on his heart. He could find no explanation for the sudden uneasiness that seemed to envelop him from within. The cup that was on the table suddenly fell, breaking into small pieces, and the hot tea splashed on the floor, creating a mess. The loud sounds of breaking dishes interrupted the silence, disturbing the calm atmosphere, and only increased his feeling of anxiety and confusion. Philomel suddenly flinched as this awkward situation began to unfold in front of her, and her face darkened a little. She looked at the spilled tea and felt her attention focused on this unfortunate moment, which drew her attention to what was happening. The maid, noticing that the situation had gotten out of control, began to apologize to the girl for her awkwardness, assuring her that she did not want to spoil the lady's tea, and, in turn, apologized for her own clumsiness, which she had not expected at all. The maid, confused, began to pick up the pieces of the cup from the floor, trying to avoid further embarrassment, because this cup was special. It belonged to the princess and was a gift from the Duke, which added even more weight to this incident. But instead of bursting into loud reproaches or curses, the girl simply asked coldly what exactly the maid was doing now, her voice full of icy confidence and calm strength, as if she expected a clear and correct answer. The maid couldn't help but tremble. Her body instantly shuddered, and her eyes closed, as if anticipating the inevitable punishment that she could suffer from her young mistress for the slightest mistake, her heart beating wildly in fear of anger. However, Philomel, holding back her irritation and trying to remain calm, only quietly and confidently said that the maid should clean everything up as quickly as possible so that the wet carpet would not be ruined, adding that there was no need to rush, since haste was fraught with injury. The maid nodded with slight surprise, still not understanding how this was possible. After all, not long ago the little girl would not have missed the opportunity to make a real spectacle, throwing a tantrum, or at least starting to complain. But this time, her behavior was unusually calm, which immediately attracted attention. But, contrary to expectations, young Philomel only smiled sweetly and, with a light intonation, said that caring for the health and well-being of the maid was more important to her than just an ordinary cup, because real care always stands above small details. When the maid told her partner what had happened, he reacted with obvious surprise, unable to believe that their mistress could show even a drop of kindness, because this was completely uncharacteristic of her usual behavior, and no one expected such an act. All the servants had expressions of deep thoughtfulness and bewilderment on their faces as to how her father's reprimand could have had such a strong effect on the princess, who had always been so impudent and rebellious that even their wildest expectations could not have predicted such a turn of events. The pink-haired maid waved her hand, noting with a slight sigh that the girl would most likely go back to being as disobedient and impudent as she had been before, and her old nature would eventually take over, as it usually did in such situations. The knight, folding his arms across his chest, calmly declared with obvious relief that, at least for a while, there would be silence in the palace, which would bring the long-awaited peace and tranquility that everyone had been waiting for so much, after all the recent unrest and various worries. The next day, the servants again discussed the young lady's successes, noticing how her behavior had changed and how she was increasingly beginning to resemble the old, familiar princess, albeit with some new features that were completely unexpected for everyone. And when another day came, the men discussed how the princess was not rude at all, but on the contrary, charming and obedient, which surprised everyone who was accustomed to her rebellious and harsh character, and everyone began to believe in her changes, believing that she might have changed forever. Even the cook breathed a sigh of relief, because the princess ate all the dishes he prepared without picking on them, as had happened before, and gratefully noting their taste, which was a great achievement and gave him confidence in his work, making him proud of his culinary talents. The servants were amazed. They could not believe that the princess had really changed and stopped behaving like a capricious, disobedient child, but instead became more mature, restrained and caring, which was not easy for anyone to understand and accept, because everyone was used to her previous antics. The nanny wiped away her tears with a handkerchief, rejoicing that her efforts, patience, and memories of raising the princess had borne their long-awaited fruit, and now the noblewoman could see the results of her labor, which contained a lot of love, care, and deep understanding, which made her heart fill with happiness. Philomel clutched her books tighter to her chest, her fingers clenching steadily, as she listened intently to her nanny's words, as she informed her that she would soon be leaving her job, leaving the position vacant due to excruciating back pain that was persistent and causing her great discomfort. The little girl was very irritated, because her thoughts revolved around how everyone around her, including the maids, completely ignored her feelings and experiences, not thinking about how much effort she put in to ensure that everything was in order, and this deeply upset her. The girl did not want to run into the constantly bustling maids once again, and therefore decided that it was better to go around them in order to avoid unnecessary conversations and awkward meetings, because her mood at that moment was far from ideal, and meeting them would certainly not improve it. But when they noticed her and started to approach, Philomel suddenly stopped, feeling her heart pounding in her chest and her body seeming to freeze in place, as if something had suddenly changed in the air, causing her to feel uneasy. Awkwardly, slightly embarrassed and puzzled, she wondered why the maids could be looking for her, because she could not understand what could have caused such attention to her, because she never attracted unnecessary attention to herself and did not understand what was happening. Philomel stood frozen in shock when she heard the news that her father had invited her to his place for a meal together, because it was so unexpected and strange that the girl could not immediately believe what was happening, and it seemed to her that she had made a mistake at some point. On the table in front of her were laid out a variety of delicacies, exquisite dishes, seafood, tender meat, fresh vegetables, and it all looked so appetizing that it was impossible not to notice how beautifully everything was presented. Each piece, each element harmoniously combined with the others. The girl sat down silently at the table, not knowing what to say or how to start the conversation, because her thoughts were filled with excitement and confusion. She could not understand how to behave in such an unusual and tense situation, and with each passing moment, her nerves became more and more tense. Opposite sat her father, and young Philomel could not understand what had suddenly made him invite her to this dinner, because there had never been such invitations before, and she could not find any explanation for what was happening, and this greatly embarrassed her, giving her no peace. Surprisingly, the emperor was the first to start the conversation, talking about what he had heard about his daughter's achievements and successes in her studies, and his words were full of sincere admiration, which surprised the girl and made her feel a little awkward, because she did not expect such compliments from her father. The girl stood awkwardly in surprise, because she had never heard praise from her father, and this was so unexpected for her that the noblewoman could not immediately find the right words to express her feelings, and was confused by such attention, not knowing how to respond. Having come to her senses, she nevertheless found the strength to speak, thanking the man for his praise. But her voice sounded uncertain, as if she herself did not believe that this situation was happening to her, and she did not know how to behave correctly at such a moment, not expecting such attention. The ruler continued his speech, saying that all the teachers admired her successes, and this could not help but touch the girl, because she did not expect such support and approval from her strict and reserved father, who rarely expressed his emotions, especially at such moments. But the man froze when he heard his daughter say not the word daddy, as he expected, but thank you, your majesty. And this caused him slight confusion, because such an address was so formal that it was difficult for him to understand her reaction, and he was momentarily speechless. The little girl silently began to eat, carefully watching every movement, as if trying to hide her awkwardness and uncertainty, and her gaze slid over the plate every now and then, forgetting about what was happening around her, absorbed in the food and the internal experiences that did not leave her. Large white windows and light, clean curtains created an atmosphere of coziness and freshness, emphasizing the simplicity, but at the same time the refined beauty of this place, where every movement and glance seemed important and filled with meaning, as if the air itself was saturated with something important. The emperor suddenly changed the subject from studies to more personal questions, asking how the princess was feeling, and his voice sounded unexpectedly soft, as if he himself did not understand why he asked such a question, because he was not inclined to personal conversations and rarely expressed his feelings. The girl lied, smiling, and said that when she took the medicine from the emperor, she immediately felt much better. But there was a slight worry in her eyes, because the noblewoman did not know how to really react to such a conversation, and confusion hovered inside her. The man nodded in response, but his thoughts seemed to have drifted into the past, and suddenly he spoke of the girl's mother, since she too had been in poor health, which seemed to awaken memories in him for a moment, and an indescribable look of hidden regret appeared in his eyes, after which he froze in thought. His gaze became more thoughtful, and something foggy was reflected in his eyes, as if he was remembering distant moments that were important and touching for him, but not ready for full awareness and acceptance. The little girl's hand trembled on the table, her fist clenched, when she heard that her father was ready to give her something as a reward for studying well. And at that moment, her heart skipped a beat with excitement, because she didn't even expect that he would be able to show such attention to her and appreciate her efforts so openly. The little girl froze, not daring to ask for the ring of their family, because it was too early for such a step, and she did not know what exactly to do. But her thoughts were filled with doubts, because the ring would mean much more than just a reward, and she could not decide on such an act. And so, slightly embarrassed and at a loss for words, she modestly replied that it was quite enough for her that the emperor had worthily appreciated her efforts, and she did not demand anything more, because for her, his praise itself was a better reward than any material reward. The ruler of the empire grabbed the glass, holding it tightly in his hand, and began to say that it was a good answer. But the throne was more fond of greedy people who always strive for power and wealth, rather than the simple joys of personal achievement, which could not help but touch her thoughts. Philomel remained silent, not knowing how to respond to such words, and her thoughts began to spin in her head, as she was not ready to enter into such deep reflections on power and values, but simply wanted to continue to be honest and sincere. Not understanding how to act in this situation, she covered her other hand with one hand, as if trying to hide her uncertainty and confusion, so as not to show her father how these words had shaken her, and continued to sit, immersed in thoughts about what was really important to her and what she felt deep down inside. After which, the noblewoman finally made up her mind and said with restraint but firmly that she had one request to make of the great emperor, and there was determination in her voice, although her heart was pounding hard, because she was not sure how it would be perceived, but she could not remain silent. The nanny was about to greet the princess, joyfully congratulating her on her return, but suddenly fell silent when she felt that the atmosphere in the room had changed, and the tension in the air became almost tangible, like a premonition of something important and unexpected. Instead of the girl, the ward, she was met by the advisor, with a polite but cold smile, hiding the tension, because he knew that his words would cause shock in everyone present, especially in the nanny herself, who seemed confident in her position. Before he began speaking, the man cleared his throat to get attention, and his face took on a more serious expression, which immediately attracted the attention of everyone in the room, because his words foreshadowed something important and inevitable, and everyone froze in anticipation, after which he announced an important decree from the emperor, saying that from now on the nanny was relieved of her duty and no longer had to look after the princess, and her place was vacant, which caused shock and bewilderment among those who were present at this announcement. The woman froze in shock, not believing her ears, because she had been promised generous compensation and good money for her previous work, and she was sure that her place in this palace was absolutely inviolable. But now all this was falling like a house of cards, destroying her confidence and future. Suddenly, behind the advisor's back, the young Philomel herself appeared, and, turning to the nanny, the noblewoman with a sweet smile uttered words that seemed so unexpected and strange for that moment when the tension was at its peak, and determination could be seen in her eyes. With a sweet smile, the little girl said that she was grateful for the nanny's care all this time, but despite her sincerity, these words sounded like a lie, because Philomel spoke slyly through her teeth, and now it was obvious to the woman that her departure was inevitable. It was a shock to the nurse, as if a terrible lightning had pierced her, and the world around her grew dim, because she could not believe that all her efforts, work, and loyalty had been so easily thrown aside, and her place was taken, as if she had never been an important part of this house. The advisor noted that the lady herself had long complained of severe pain in her lower back, which allegedly could affect her ability to continue working, although everyone understood that this was more of an excuse than a real reason for her inevitable dismissal, since she had not lived up to the trust for a long time. The nanny tried to convince everyone that she was still full of energy and ready to work, insisting that she could not just lose her high position in the palace, because for her it was more than just a place, it was her life, stability, and well-being, which she did not want to give up. Hiding behind the back of the advisor and the emperor, Philomel quietly but evilly laughed, glad that she was finally getting rid of this evil woman who had always been so strict, domineering, and unyielding, and her departure, in the princess's opinion, was natural and well-deserved. Suddenly, the girl's attention was drawn to other voices that were whispering among themselves, discussing how they would now cope without the elusive manager, because her departure put them in a very difficult situation, for which they were completely unprepared and untrained, which only added panic to the air. These were young maids who did not know what to do now, because they were too inexperienced and had neither the strength nor the confidence to cope with the new duties that had suddenly fallen on their fragile shoulders and absorbed their attention, introducing additional chaos. Philomel thought to herself that it wouldn't hurt to remove the other maids from their positions and throw them out of the palace, because in her opinion, the fewer people in this palace, the easier it is to manage the situation and control the whole environment, being in the center of attention, which only strengthened her position. And although she felt a certain amount of regret at the disappearance of the old faces, young Philomel knew that this was a necessary step in order to make the lovely palace even more amenable to her control, and she could calmly dispose of everything. After that, Philomel turned to the balcony, looking at the serene sky, feeling that she had finally managed to change the course of events, at least a little. And in her soul there was a strange mixture of pride and anxiety, as if everything was too easy, and she still felt some kind of emptiness. Philomel changed, and as soon as a fresh wind blew in her face, her hair became disheveled. Her thoughts were carried away by everything around her, and the world around her became a little more alive for her than ever. And this unexpected change of mood filled her with inner energy, making her feel free. The blue sky, the leaves on the trees, the coolness of the weather, all of this reminded her that the world was not always under her control, and she could not change everything at once. But at least she tried, and this already meant something to her, even if the changes were not so global. Several days passed, and loud footsteps were heard along the corridor, disturbing her thoughts. Each step was like a reminder that life does not stand still, and everything can change in one moment, when the right moment comes, and the noblewoman is ready for new challenges. The advisor knocked politely on the door and asked permission before entering, his voice sounding confident but not without some tension, as if he was ready to say something important that could change the atmosphere in the castle and turn everything upside down. There, inside, the princess was already waiting for the man, dressed in a new red dress that emphasized her grace and beauty, as well as a cap that gave her appearance a special sophistication, which gave her a unique, mysterious look in which there was something enchanting. However, next to the princess stood a new maid in a gray pantsuit, with gray hair. Her face expressed calm, and her eyes, full of respect and attentiveness, said that she was proud of her role and considered her place in this palace special. The woman said with a smile that if the lady needed anything, she should boldly contact her, promising to always be there and carry out any assignments, like a faithful servant, ready to support the princess at any moment, which confirmed her sincere desire to be useful. The princess nodded soberly, accepting her new position and her new nanny, whom others already called Countess Dels, for she was not only her servant, but wore her role with such ease and dignity that she deserved respect. The woman looked friendly, her smile was sincere and open, completely unlike the evil, tense smile of the previous nanny, who always hid some secret intentions, and Philomel felt that in front of her stood a person ready to take care of her with real attention and warmth. The hallway was lit by candlesticks attached to the walls, their soft light creating a cozy atmosphere, and the windows, wide open, allowed bright daylight to penetrate the room, filling it with warmth, while quiet conversations flared up outside the windows. Countess Dels was in complete shock when she learned that she had been chosen to serve the princess, because she had not expected that such an honor would be bestowed upon her. A woman's heart was filled with many feelings, from surprise and confusion to slight excitement, but she tried her best to hide it. Light poured brightly from the windows, penetrating the room and reflecting the green expanses of nature, which was as if in the palm of your hand, creating the feeling that the world outside the walls of the palace was alive and full of energy, and an unusual silence reigned in the room, in which only important words were heard. The young princess smiled sweetly over a cup of tea in her new red dress, and was silent, immersed in her thoughts. Her gaze was both tired and calm, as if she were in her own cozy world that did not require words and unnecessary actions. The countess sat next to her, also smiling, but her soul was filled with doubts, because despite all the kind words, she was tormented by questions, thinking that all this, perhaps, was just rumors that the princess was a capricious and difficult child, and that in reality she could turn out to be completely different. She couldn't understand why such bad rumors about the girl suddenly started circulating, because before no one dared to say anything bad about her, and it all seemed completely unbelievable, as if the world around her had changed in an instant, and everything became foggy and incomprehensible. Suddenly, her thoughts were interrupted by the voice of Philomel, who, turning to the countess, asked with curiosity and in a light tone whether she understood fashion, and, without waiting for an answer, added with lively interest that she would be very interested to know the lady's opinion about the dresses in her closet. Embarrassed, the little girl put her hands to her cheeks, almost as a sign of shame, and, blushing slightly, invited the lady to look at her outfits, which, in her opinion, were very beautiful and elegant, because she wanted to receive an honest and sincere assessment, as well as hear advice on how to look better. The countess, after thinking for a moment, and not wanting to refuse the princess, agreed to her proposal without hesitation, realizing that this was a good way to get to know her tastes and preferences better, as well as to see how seriously she took fashion and elegance, and maybe even learn about her secrets. Philomel, unable to contain her excitement and giving in to her agitation, suddenly jumped up from her chair, full of energy, and, with an expression on her face that spoke of her impatience, asked if they could begin examining the dresses right then, at that moment, without putting it off until later. The girl took the woman's hand and pulled it gently along with her, confidently heading towards her room, where her little fashion kingdom was eagerly waiting to be revealed, like an invitation to a world of her personal preferences, full of vibrant fabrics and gorgeous outfits. With slight delight and enthusiasm, the noblewoman continued to pull the lady, assuring her that the countess would be truly surprised when she saw her huge wardrobe, full of luxurious outfits, each of which was chosen with love and meticulous attention to the smallest details. With a light laugh full of kindness, Countess Dels smiled tenderly, watching how her young mistress, despite her outward confidence, still remained somewhat of a child, her behavior still retaining some of its childish charm. When they approached the closet, Philomel proudly opened its doors, and inside was a real paradise for fashion lovers. Many different dresses, different shades, fabrics, and styles, which spoke of her refined taste and passion for luxury. The little girl, noticing how the Countess was examining her outfits, turned to her with genuine interest, wanting to know her opinion about the dresses, and with a lively expression on her face, asked how she assessed her choice, because it was very important for her to hear the opinion of an experienced person. Philomel happily began to talk about her dresses, which she had bought last spring, and among them a special place was occupied by her favorite dress, which remained for her a symbol of comfort and elegance, incomparable to anything else, despite the diversity of her wardrobe. Thoughtfully, lightly touching her chin, she carefully examined the outfits, which were beautiful, but at the same time, something about them bothered her. Although the dress looked perfect, there was a feeling that something was wrong, as if there was something extra in it, which was sometimes difficult to explain in words. The dresses in the little girl's closet were not arranged properly and looked a little untidy. They were all slightly wrinkled and not quite neatly folded, giving the impression that someone was in a hurry and did not attach due importance to putting them in order. The Countess, indignantly folding her arms across her chest, realized with slight irritation that this princess had not been looked after nearly as carefully as she should have been, since her wardrobe was far from ideal, as he had imagined. But suddenly, Philomel took her favorite blue dress out of the closet. Delas nodded to the little girl, and she herself cast a sideways glance at the maids, who were clearly not doing their job very well, giving the impression that they were not paying enough attention to their work, and this clearly bothered her greatly. Philomel herself quietly and with pleasure narrowed her eyes, realizing that her cunning plan had worked, because the noblewoman had ensured that everything happened exactly as she had planned, and now she could enjoy the result of her intricate work and cunning strategy. After some time, the old maids were fired and new ones were hired in their place, which symbolized significant changes in the house, because now everything had to be done impeccably and at the highest level, as she demanded from everyone, from each one. Some brave knights were also dismissed, as the management realized that it was necessary to cut the budget and get rid of unnecessary expenses in order to maintain harmony and order in matters that required special attention and at the same time a reasonable approach. The princess's old nanny was also punished for her poor service and neglect of the princess, for her negligence in her duties could not remain without consequences, and she suffered the deserved punishment for her carelessness and negligence. The woman, kneeling, began to cry loudly, unable to contain her emotions, and claimed that she was not to blame for what had happened, desperately declaring that if Mrs. Isabel had been alive, there would not have been such disorder and chaos in the house, and everything would have been under strict control and in perfect order. The maid, smiling slightly, carefully combed the princess's long hair, deftly giving each strand an ideal appearance, as if this ritual of caring for her appearance concealed not only her professional pride, but also deep respect for her role in the princess's life. The new maid helped the little girl with her hair, chatting about the latest gossip, discussing the events that were happening in the royal palace, and doing this with the intention of attracting her attention and pleasing her, in order to gain her trust, because she knew that this was important for her position. The beautiful countess, thinking to herself, came to the thought that it must have been difficult for the princess to hear news about her old nanny, because she had spent many years next to her, caring for and supporting her, becoming almost a family member with whom it was difficult to part. But young Philomel, on the contrary, showed neither sadness nor confusion. Her feminine face remained calm and unperturbed, as if this news had not touched her at all, and she had long since resigned herself to the fact that all things in life eventually come to an end. The unexpectedly beautiful princess, smiling, quietly but confidently, uttered a mysterious phrase, as if addressing not only her maids, but also herself. What goes around comes around, leaving everyone perplexed and making them think about the hidden meaning of her words. The maids standing nearby froze in surprise, not expecting to hear such words full of wisdom from the princess. They did not know how to react, because her calmness and confidence seemed unyielding, as if she was sure of her every word. The countess, hearing the little girl speak in such an adult tone, smiled softly and, with a slight sigh, said that she would order a cozy sleeping place to be prepared for her as soon as the princess wished to rest, and everything would be ready according to her wishes. Philomel, having sincerely thanked the woman for her attention and care, expressed her gratitude with a grateful look, but she, smiling softly and modestly, replied that there was no need to thank her, as if the care itself was such a natural and self-evident action for her that it did not require any words. The maid, having finished carefully combing Philomel's hair, bowed respectfully and left the rich room to lead the little girl to her quarters, ready to do everything to make her stay comfortable and calm, as well as a great responsibility. Philomel could not help but notice to herself how striking and fascinating Dels was, a woman who possessed a rare combination of intelligence, strength, and unrivaled talent, which made her a truly delightful and admirable figure. This woman was truly a rare phenomenon, not only incredibly intelligent and gifted, but also endowed with inner strength, capable of overcoming any trials, as if fate itself blessed her with great achievements and unwavering fortitude. Philomel briefly thought about how exhausted and worn out this woman looked. She wanted to relax, to immerse herself in the long-awaited peace, but she knew that the time for rest had not yet come, and new difficult trials awaited her ahead. A little girl, dressed in a light nightgown, walked slowly along a winding path, a timid but unshakable hope glimmering in her heart that something bright and kind awaited her beyond the horizon, like a cherished dream, to which every careful step led her. The expanses of the azure sky, like a boundless ocean of light, stretched out over the earth. Their bottomless blueness was reflected in the swaying crowns of trees that obediently bowed under the gentle gusts of wind, filling the world with a feeling of peace, harmony, and magical silence. In her graceful female hands rested a silver tray, on which stood a small, elegantly decorated bottle with a magic potion, mysteriously shimmering in the semi-darkness, as if in its depths was hidden the very secret of the night sky, woven from riddles, charms, and ancient spells. The countess, slightly squinting, and with a slight curiosity in her voice, handed the strange potion to the princess, trying to understand for what purpose such a young lady wished to obtain this unusual elixir, and what the noblewoman was going to do with it at such a late hour. Without a moment's hesitation, Philomel confidently grabbed the small bottle with her slender fingers and, without even trying to hide her intentions, admitted without a shadow of a doubt that she intended to add this magical potion to the master's drink in order to present it to him as a gift. The lady raised an elegant eyebrow in mild surprise, looking closely at the little girl, and then asked in a soft but intent voice whether she really intended to quietly pour the mysterious potion into the emperor's own cup, risking causing unpredictable consequences. Philomel nodded confidently, her voice calm, as she explained that she had once read in an ancient book that certain herbs had amazing properties that could relieve a person from the painful effects of heavy drinking and a severe hangover. Beautiful Dels thought for a moment, because usually such plants were used exclusively in medicine, and it was extremely rare for anyone to resort to their use in cooking or everyday life, especially in relation to the imperial court. Philomel, full of delight and anticipation, with sparks of excitement in her eyes, hastily turned to the woman with a request to prepare an elegant cup, suitable dishes, and aromatic, freshly brewed tea, in order to then carefully and imperceptibly add this mysterious potion to it. As she walked, waving her arms and barely containing her impatience, the little girl hurriedly waved after the departing countess, calling out loudly to her and insistently reminding her not to forget to take filter paper with her, an important detail, without which the drink could lose its purity and sophistication before serving. Philomel, holding her breath, slowly and with extreme caution, turned her fingers, smoothly removing the lid from the small bottle in which the mysterious potion was stored, fully aware that its smell, color, and even consistency could be completely unpredictable and perhaps even frightening. As soon as she opened the small lid, a sharp, suffocating smell instantly filled the space, forcing her to immediately cover her nose with her hand, wincing from the unpleasant aroma, reminiscent of a mixture of rotten herbs, medicinal decoctions, and something strangely bitter. The girl frowned, realizing that even if the desire to get rid of the painful hangover was great, this terribly smelling drink turned out to be so disgusting that forcing herself to take at least one sip seemed like a real test of her will and patience. But suddenly, her gaze fell on another, much larger bottle, inside of which a thick, shimmering gold liquid was shimmering, and, unable to contain her delight, she gasped barely audibly, enchanted by the way the light played in the depths of this magical elixir. With dexterous hands, slightly trembling with anticipation, the noblewoman carefully placed the bottle on the table, where there was already a vessel filled with the purest, fragrant juice, extracted from the fruits of the legendary world tree, which was considered the source of vitality and wisdom. If you combine this wonderful, viscous nectar with tart, potent herbs, you can get not just a medicinal infusion, but a truly aromatic, enchanting tea that can not only banish the effects of a stormy evening, but also restore clarity of thought and ease of breathing. Standing in the room, shrouded in soft semi-darkness, the little girl took a deep breath and, folding her hands in front of her, humbly asked for forgiveness from the real princess whose priceless elixir she had just discovered, because now she needed this wonderful potion more than ever before. Philomel, with her head bowed and her hands folded before her in a gesture of submission, quietly and with deep regret, asked forgiveness from her sister, whose generous heart had always forgiven her mistakes, accepting with mercy all the oddities and sometimes hard deeds that she had often bitterly regretted. The little girl, who was completely absorbed in the delicate art of preparing tea, was suddenly interrupted by the loud voice of her elder sister, who, with a light step, entered the room, carrying a tray with the necessary things that Philomel had asked her to take care of for the completion of the important ritual. Soon the pleasant tea was ready, and from the silver teapot, filled with the aromas of herbs and forest green spaces, the cup slowly filled, from which soft steam rose to the ceiling, promising relief and peace, so necessary in this anxious moment. Sister Philomel was so incredibly generous and kind-hearted that she could treat not only her family with this valuable potion, but also any random knight or lost vagabond, generously sharing with them not only the gifts of nature, but also the warmth of her soul. However, Philomel was different. Instead of simply enjoying a cup of the miraculous drink, she held the spoon in her hands with thoughts of how to use this special tea for her own benefit, in order to get the maximum benefit from it for herself. Before serving the tea to her father, the little girl, overwhelmed with impatience and curiosity, could not resist, and, containing her excitement, decided to taste the drink, carefully bringing the spoon to her lips to check whether the aroma and taste matched her expectations and plans. With a sparkle in her eyes and involuntary satisfaction, the beauty joyfully exclaimed that the tea was finally ready, and, smiling proudly, said that everything had turned out exactly as she had planned. Now all that was left was to serve this wonderful drink to please her loved ones. On the tray, besides the cup of steaming tea, stood a small sugar bowl filled with crystal white sugar, which was to be added for those who preferred sweetness in the drink, promising not only quenching of thirst, but also quiet harmony for the soul. The advisor, feeling the importance of what was happening and having no time to delay, threw open the door with a loud bang, entered the room, and with burning eyes, hurried to call the emperor, not hiding his impatience to convey the most important news, which could not tolerate a minute's delay. Meanwhile, the ruler of the empire himself was still peacefully dozing in his bed, consumed by a severe headache that had been tormenting him since the morning, and was not ready to leave his cozy fortress, despite all the fuss flaring up around him. The man's hand tightly clutched the black sheet, filled with anger and irritation. His body seemed ready to break free from the shackles of pain and fatigue that had haunted him since the morning, giving him no rest and taking away his strength with every movement, like a merciless storm. In one corner of the room, a man rose from his bed and angrily ordered his advisor to shut his mouth, his voice full of displeasure, and every word sounded like a direct order that did not tolerate objections or doubts, which could only infuriate him even more. He sternly ordered the servants not to shout, as his head ached from a terrible hangover, which did not leave him even after a night's rest, as if reminding him of yesterday's excesses and disgusting condition, leaving him practically without strength. But then, suddenly, the man noticed that his little daughter was standing next to him, with a tray in her hands, on which rested a cup of hot tea. Her caring gaze radiated tenderness and attention, a readiness to support in this difficult moment, despite all the chaos around. With a smile shining on her face, the beauty curiously asked the emperor how he was feeling, expressing her sincere concern and gently trying to dispel his discontent and the pain that had become a heavy burden on his shoulders, giving his day at least a drop of lightness and calm. The girl explained with concern that, having heard about his poor health, she decided to bring him some healing tea, hoping that this drink could ease his suffering, help him cope with the illness that had been tormenting him for several days, exhausting both his body and mind. Shaking his head in displeasure, the man slowly brought the cup of mountain herbs, knowing full well that their taste was always unpleasant, and despite all their beneficial properties, they left a strange and bitter sensation on the tongue that did not bring the slightest pleasure. The advisor, noticing his reaction, pointed his hand at the princess and respectfully noted that the girl herself had prepared this tea, which was quite worthy of praise, since the ability to create such a drink required a lot of effort, especially for those who were not accustomed to tart and bitter herbs. Philomel, smiling, said that the smell of the tea might not be entirely pleasant, but the taste was quite normal, assuring her father that her efforts, despite initial doubts, would still bring the expected result and help improve his well-being, bringing relief. The little girl took a sharp step back and frowned as she smelled the foul smell of alcohol in the air that was coming from her father, filling the space with a heavy, unpleasant aroma that made her face immediately contort in disgust. The man, realizing that he was smelling a strong odor of alcohol, covered his mouth with his hand and winced slightly in shame, realizing how unpleasant it could be, and, with slight irritation, asked his daughter to move away from him. But the girl, despite his words, did not listen and stayed nearby, trying to help. With trembling hands, excitement in her eyes, and slight fear, she nevertheless decided to present the tray to her father, overcoming her awkwardness and embarrassment, despite the disgusting smell of alcohol and her own anxiety, because her father was clearly not in the best condition. The emperor, observing her determination and perseverance at that moment, was both struck by her courage and touched by her tenacity, and, frozen for a moment, did not know what to say, for the noblewoman had shown such fortitude despite all the difficulties she had encountered. Without thinking twice, the man quickly snatched the tray from the little girl's hands and pressed it to himself with an expression on his face that left no doubt that her efforts had been noticed and appreciated, despite his grave condition and constant irritation from a hangover. The ruler of the empire, still suffering from a hangover, accepted the cup from which demons seemed to emerge, as if its magic itself filled the air with a heavy and strange smell. But he decided not to hesitate and drink the drink, not wanting to show weakness or disappoint his daughter. In one gulp, under the attentive gaze of everyone present, the emperor drank the entire cup to the bottom, without allowing himself a single unnecessary movement, as if he had decided that in this way he would be able to cope with the excruciating headache and fatigue that had not left him for a long time. Suddenly, he froze, feeling that the taste of the drink was not at all as unpleasant as he expected, but, on the contrary, showed a strange harmony which made him fall silent and think, because the thought arose in his mind that perhaps this tea was not just a drink, Philomel beamed when she heard her father say that the drink tasted bearable, and she felt that her efforts were appreciated, because despite her awkwardness, the drink really did help to get rid of the unbearable sensations and made him feel better. The beauty happily babbled, explaining that she had added the juice of the world tree to the tea to rid it of the unpleasant taste of bitter herbs, and to make the drink more pleasant to perceive, which, of course, was an important achievement for her, which she was proud of. The man was greatly surprised by her words, and so Philomel confidently confirmed that the man himself had once given her this fruit, which puzzled the emperor even more, making him think that his daughter had always shown such resourcefulness and determination that he had not expected. The little girl, contented, and with a sincere smile on her face, happily said that she had not suffered from illness for a long time, while the emperor continued to feel ill, tormented by his hangover, which did not leave him even at this moment, because of which he could not concentrate. The advisor, with a slight reproach in his voice and visible concern for the state of the ruler, noted that the emperor of the empire should get rid of the pernicious habit of drinking so much if he really wanted to maintain his health and truly rest and not suffer from the consequences. The stern emperor, not looking particularly pleased with this remark, continued to be rude, feeling the irritation of a hangover that would not leave him, despite the efforts of those around him to help and offer ways to ease his painful condition. The ruler's drinking began after his beloved wife passed away, leaving an inexplicable void in his soul, which he tried to fill with alcohol, but this only aggravated his inner pain and suffering, giving him no peace. Philomel, remembering that it was her mother, who turned out to be the very false princess from whom it all began, could not hold back a deep sigh, frightened, and shaking her head, decided to drive away these dark thoughts, so as not to plunge into the abyss of sadness and despair. At that moment, the emperor himself suddenly turned to her, and his words, filled with gratitude and recognition, sounded like a long-awaited relief for her soul. He said that she had saved him from excruciating headaches, and now she had the right to ask for something in return. Young Philomel, feeling a wave of relief and realizing the importance of what was happening, wondered what she could ask the ruler, because now, it seemed, a unique chance had opened up before her to change her destiny and get what she had dreamed of for so long. The ruler, feeling that her request was important to her, began to listen attentively to her words, sitting in bed with a tired but interested look, ready to listen to everything that she wished to tell him, despite his fatigue and headache. The weather was truly magnificent that day, filling the air with freshness and a light scent of nature. The fountain located in the center of the garden radiated amazing tranquility. Its water, shimmering in the rays of the sun, gave the garden an atmosphere of serene happiness. The girl walked quietly on the grass, following the neat fence that enclosed the garden, and a feeling of harmony arose in her soul, because fresh grass swayed smoothly around her, and the air was filled with the aroma of flowering plants, creating an atmosphere of calm and peace. The princess was very pleased that she had chosen this particular place for her walk, because, enjoying the silence and beauty of the garden, the noblewoman felt safe and already imagined how she would rule the empire as a determined and wise heiress. Suddenly, as if an invisible force was pushing the events, footsteps were heard next to her, and soon, not without a slight rustle of leaves, a boy appeared, apparently no older than her, which immediately attracted attention, because his proximity was unexpected and made her wary. The boy shouted at her to let her know that only members of the imperial family were allowed in the garden. His words were rather harsh, but there was no malice in them, only a stern and confident tone that made her pause for a moment. He was a young man with blonde hair, dressed in an elegant uniform reminiscent of the aristocratic style. He looked cute, but there was some rudeness in his behavior, as if he wanted to demonstrate his arrogant confidence and belonging to high society. The boy suddenly pointed his finger at her and shouted loudly, demanding that they find out what noble family she belonged to, because if she did not know this, then the commoners who happened to be here would immediately be subjected to cruel and merciless punishment. The young man did not calm down, continuing to shout that she must be expelled immediately, and also threatened with cruel punishment, which could not help but irritate those around him, especially with his endless loud indignation, which only further heated up the atmosphere and increased the overall tension. Philomel, despite her irritation, smiled sweetly and said softly that the guy should speak more quietly, while calmly putting her hands in front of her, as if trying to soften the tense atmosphere and prevent further rash actions that could lead to trouble. But the next moment, her sweet expression changed to irritation when the boy, without embarrassment, told her to shut up. The impudent male words, as if breaking the silence, made her gaze become hard, and her voice, cold and decisive, as if she was no longer ready to tolerate his antics. Suddenly, the young man became frightened, because the little girl, who seemed so harmless, suddenly straightened her shoulders and, confidently looking at him, ordered him to close his mouth. Her voice sounded calm, but there was such strength in it that the boy, as if frozen, immediately fell silent. Frightened, the young man began to babble, trying to justify himself, and justifying himself by the fact that he came from a noble family, as if this could somehow change the situation or influence her attitude towards his rudeness and impudence at the moment. Philomel frowned, surprised at how stupid this young man could be, who apparently didn't even know that she, too, came from an ancient line that had nothing to do with his claims to high birth, and perhaps even more so. Liam, that was the guy's name, growled ominously, declaring that he would definitely tell his mother everything that had happened, while trying to assure everyone that he was not at all evil, despite his rude and irritating behavior, which no doubt alarmed everyone present. It was his mother and elder brother, aristocrats, with their fair hair, blondes, whose beauty was truly unearthly, as if nature itself had generously endowed them with splendor, leaving nothing superfluous and emphasizing their impeccable origin. Philomel was shocked by the appearance of the marquise. Her face sparkled with dazzling beauty, and her posture was motionless, as if she had frozen at some point, not expecting such an unexpected meeting, and her soul was squeezed with excitement and confusion, not knowing how to react. Suddenly, the woman slammed her fan shut. Her abrupt actions seemed to break the silence, and then she approached Philomel with a smile. They had not met for a long time, but they instantly found a common language, as if there had been no long years of separation, and their friendship remained untouched. The Marchioness was a distant relative of the princess's father. Her connection to the royal family was noticeable, but not very close, but her influence in society remained undeniable and powerful, and she skillfully used her position for political manipulation and personal gain. The reason why the woman remained in the court was simple. The marquise quickly got her bearings in the new political situation and without hesitation sided with the new ruler, deciding to support him in order to maintain her position and ensure the future of her family. She had 2 sons, and the eldest was predicted to have a great future, predicting that he would soon become the emperor next to the throne, which gave her family not only special importance, but also considerable influence in political circles, thereby strengthening the ambitions of the marquise herself. Young Philomel clenched her fists nervously, realizing that she might be doubted because of her appearance, since she herself did not possess magical abilities, which could become a cause for discontent, suspicion, and deprive her of trust in the eyes of others. Young Liam was still very small, and his eyes sparkled with delight when he realized that before him stood the princess of the empire herself, a figure so majestic and significant that his heart was filled with undisguised admiration and childish amazement at such a miracle. When the boy almost let it slip that his mother had once called the princess ugly, the woman quickly covered his mouth with her hand, trying to stifle the accidental confession, while Philomel herself felt quite upset and embarrassed. The girl could barely contain her anger when she realized how contemptuously the marquise had spoken of her, calling her ugly, and for a moment disappointment flashed in her eyes, as if she realized how deeply disrespectful her appearance had been judged. The elder son was a true gentleman, and, feeling the awkwardness of the situation, he respectfully apologized to Philomel for his younger brother's thoughtless words, knowing full well that his behavior was completely inappropriate and could cause offense. After the eldest son apologized, they hurried to leave the room, because they already had an important family event planned, a walk during which they were supposed to spend time with their loved ones, forgetting about all the misunderstandings and tension that had arisen earlier. Philomel did not detain them and watched them go with a strained smile, feeling how her soul was becoming heavy from unpleasant thoughts, but trying not to show it, hiding her true feelings behind external politeness and calm. Liam, however, happily joked to his brother that when he became emperor, they should turn this garden into a huge playground, not paying attention to the seriousness of the situation, and his voice sounded sincere, like that of a boy dreaming of great and wonderful changes. The eldest son quietly whispered to the youngest that it was too early to talk about such things, trying to gently tame his childish restlessness and redirect his attention to more important topics, to which Liam grumbled in response, not really understanding why it was not worth dreaming about such a future right now. The little girl sighed heavily and decided to pretend that she had not heard anything, trying not to spoil the relationship in the family, hiding her worries and resentment, as if absorbed in an internal conflict in order to maintain peace and tranquility in the house, despite all the complexity of the situation and tension. Liam walked forward, looking forward to further adventures, and the eldest son turned around and politely said goodbye to the princess, showing good manners and respect despite the awkwardness and inner tension in the air. Philomel remained silent, not answering. Her gaze remained gloomy, and her thoughts were confused and full of disappointment, like a storm in her soul, and she did not want to enter into unnecessary conversations that could only aggravate her inner experiences and even lead to an open confrontation, which she was so afraid of. Her hands were clenched into fists, and she could barely contain her anger, feeling how it was gradually accumulating inside, but still trying not to let it break out, so as not to destroy even the remnants of harmony and relationships with the people around her. Understanding how important this fragile world was, she suddenly made a decision and asked the Marquise's family to stay, despite all the awkwardness of the situation, and, gathering all her determination, she expressed her opinion, realizing that only in this way could the noblewoman regain control over what was happening and defend her right to respect. The brother and sister and the woman herself stood up abruptly, waiting for her to speak. Their gazes were wary and tense, as if prepared for any development of events, and each moment of waiting seemed endlessly long, creating a tense atmosphere in the room. The Marquise, clearly surprised, turned around at the girl's words that they should have greeted her properly, and not so dismissively. Her face froze for a moment, and a slight irony flashed in her eyes from the unexpected performance. But deep down, a hidden anxiety was felt. Intrigued, Philomel asked whether, when the Marquise herself was a princess, her relatives greeted her just as rudely, without hiding their surprise and bewilderment, as if this were the norm, and her question sounded with a subtle hint of a discrepancy between behavior and titles. The woman fixed her with a look of stern displeasure, with an expression on her face that boded no good, and, as if trying to hide her anger, covered her mouth with her fan, doing so with a gesture that said more than words could express. The princess did not take her eyes off her, standing steadfastly, not giving in a single step. Her self-confidence was obvious. Despite the internal tension and the complexity of the situation, she was ready to fight for her right to respect, not retreating, no matter how difficult it was for her, accepting every challenge with dignity. The whole family was surprised by her great determination, and the mother and the youngest member of the family were openly outraged that this girl, it would seem, dared to demand from them what they considered absolutely unacceptable, and they could hardly contain their displeasure. The Marquise, realizing the complexity of what was happening and her internal struggle, decided to show compliance, agreeing to conditions that seemed completely unusual to her, because at certain moments, giving in is not weakness, but strength, capable of opening up new horizons. Slightly bending down, the lady greeted the prince with elegant grace and refined politeness. Her gesture was full of respect and deep reverence. The noblewoman carefully watched her every movement so as not to disturb the atmosphere of impeccable observance of etiquette. However, as soon as she finished her bow, her heart sank in shock. A girl appeared in front of her who seemed to not only accept her gesture as a sign of respect, but was preparing to kneel, which made her freeze in amazement and confusion. The Marquise, in complete shock and confusion, barely containing her anger, exclaimed, not understanding how such behavior could be accepted at such a high level, and the girl, not hiding her determination, gestured for her to get down on the ground, as if she could decide everything. The beauty frowned. Her face became tense, and her gaze was as icy as the winter wind, and she could not understand how it was possible to meet the heir to the throne in such an inappropriate and completely ridiculous way, causing only bewilderment and irritation. The marquise was greatly surprised and outraged by the girl's behavior. Her anger quickly grew, because such impudence could not remain without consequences, and she was already preparing to yell at the impudent person, who clearly did not understand her position and the limits of what was permitted. The beautiful princess, however, answered sullenly, asking in bewilderment whether the noblewoman had said something wrong, since, despite her youth, she was still the daughter of an emperor, and knew well that her status required special respect and attention from those around her. Once upon a time, the marquise herself was a princess, and in those distant years, all secular people, without exception, bowed to their knees before her, recognizing her greatness, equanimity, and the indisputability of her position. But since then, much has changed, and her status has already lost the same inviolability. The lady, unable to contain her rage, clenched her fist in front of her with force, her eyes sparkling with contempt and anger. She was deeply outraged by the impudence of the girl, who dared to order her around, not realizing that her high position required much more respect and humility. The beauty looked down sullenly, trying to hide her inner irritation and discontent, not wanting to be taken seriously as part of high society, especially when someone tried to put her in her place, not realizing her true strength, dignity, and status. In the midst of their tense conversation, Liam intervened, loudly declaring that the princess was talking absolute nonsense, claiming that it was his brother who was the true heir to the throne, and not this self-confident, impudent girl who imagined herself above everyone else and took on too much. The beauty, not hiding her surprise and slight contempt, folded her arms across her chest, and, looking closely at the boy, coldly asked him if he even realized what nonsense he had just said, and whether he understood what an offensive disrespect he had demonstrated towards her with his behavior. The boy seemed not to be watching his words at all, and without thinking, he began to assert that when his brother ascended the throne, the princess would not even greet him, and all this was said with such force, as if he did not understand the seriousness of the situation. Suddenly, a tall, almost ominous figure appeared behind the young princess, and at that moment, everything around her seemed to freeze, filled with a tense sense of inevitability, as if something fateful and irreparable was about to happen. It was the emperor himself, her father, who, hearing the urgent noise and feeling the alarm spreading throughout the hall, could not remain on the sidelines and, despite his high position, decided to personally sort out what had caused such a violent excitement among those present. The little girl, with slight irritation and determination in her movements, turned to her father, the emperor, clearly expressing her dissatisfaction with what was happening, as if the whole truth was already in her eyes, and she wanted him to understand who was really right in this situation. And then, at that very moment, a clear thought came to the prince, and his face slightly twisted as he remembered the words she had once spoken, claiming that her eldest son, and not she, would be the next emperor, and this could not help but affect his reaction. The princess, with slight irritation and confusion in her eyes, began to complain about the behavior of the lady's family, turning to her father and trying to find out whether they were telling the truth or simply making up everything that was happening around them, not understanding who was actually right. The marquise and her eldest son, holding back their emotions and remaining calm, began to assert that nothing of the sort had happened, and that they had not had even the slightest relation to what could be perceived as a lie or misunderstanding, thereby justifying themselves. With a perfect but cold expression on his face, the emperor, like a true ruler of his empire, asked if they had claimed that the princess had not spoken the truth, hinting that the truth might have been hidden or distorted, without paying attention to their words. Philomel, suddenly feeling alarmed and with a bewildered expression, turned sharply as soon as she heard the accusations against her, and seemed to understand with every word that children might often resort to deception for their own interests, in order to hide the truth from others. With a twitching grin, the Marquise tried to persuade the emperor not to punish his daughter too harshly, since she was still very young. And such severity could leave her with deep emotional and mental trauma for life, which would be unfair. Philomel was firmly convinced that the truth was on her side, but she did not dare express her opinion to her father, since she doubted that he would really believe her, since her words might seem only a weak excuse and not a serious, well-reasoned argument. The ruler of the empire looked at her with a cold, almost dispassionate gaze, showing no emotion, but was silent, as if expecting something, as if weighing every word and preparing for a decisive step that would finally clarify the whole situation. Philomel, quietly and hesitantly, began to say that she had not lied, but could not provide any evidence to back up her words, which caused her confidence to gradually melt away, leaving only doubts and confusion that poisoned her soul. The Marquise's family stood aside, watching the proceedings like vile, cold-blooded aristocrats, showing no sympathy, only curious to see how this spectacle would end and who would emerge victorious in this moral conflict, because they didn't care. The noble lady who had lied stood calmly, with an air of complete confidence, as if she were convinced that her deception would go unnoticed, and no one would discover her cunning plan, which revolved around the truth, because she felt herself inviolable. Almost crying, Philomel, in her blue dress, with a trembling voice, said that the noblewoman had heard everything correctly and would not dare to lie to the emperor, feeling how her words were losing their power under the pressure of other people's looks, and the fear, seizing her heart, did not allow her to utter a single word of confidence. The girl frowned, her face full of bitterness and disappointment, and she quietly whispered that she was telling the truth, but her doubts and fear of the consequences made her words sound more and more timid and quieter each time, as if her voice was fading. Lakovo, Philomel's father, knelt down beside his daughter with tenderness and care, gently placed his hand on her cheek, and told her that she was not one to lie, and that he had always believed in her honesty, despite all the doubts and accusations that arose around her. After which, he looked away, a little embarrassed, and added that even if she turned out to be a liar, he, as an emperor, would be no better than a noblewoman, because he often hides his truth for the sake of maintaining power, order, and stability in the empire, which does not make him an example to follow. The Marquise shuddered in horror when she learned that the emperor himself had heard the whole truth, and now left no doubt that her deception could be exposed, which greatly affected her confidence and desire to continue the fight for her reputation. But now she felt vulnerable. The lady, stunned by what was happening, shuddered when her eldest son, realizing the gravity of the situation, approached and began to ask forgiveness from the ruler of the empire, as if admitting his guilt, repenting and trying to smooth over the consequences of his actions, which had become irreparable. The younger son, in turn, was surprised, watching his brother, who, it would seem, did not experience such strong emotions, and looked with bewilderment at his bows and apologies, wondering why he suddenly decided to apologize to the emperor and what effect this would have. The boy became angry when his stupid little brother loudly said that the emperor himself had previously wanted to pass on the rank and title to him in the future, which was another heavy blow to his face, destroying all his proud ambitions and dreams of the future he had built for himself. Philomel, feeling her inner world fill with anger and disappointment, glared at them, realizing that they were nothing more than arrogant and cynical aristocrats who, hiding behind a mask of nobility, did not hesitate to hypocritically lie and manipulate others. The Marquise's youngest son, Liam, clutched his head in panic, as if unable to understand what was happening, and with a plaintive, almost tearful voice, whined why his brother hit him so painfully, not realizing that his words could cause so much harm and why his attention suddenly seemed so important to everyone around him. The eldest son, clearly shocked, threw up his hands and promised the emperor that he had not said such a thing, that his relative simply had an overly vivid imagination, and that perhaps he had not understood at all what was being discussed, trying to minimize the consequences of his words. Philomel, wiping tears from her eyes, increasingly lost faith in these people, because they were the ones who once tried to expose her as a liar, and now, When she was fighting for the truth, they again played on her feelings, trying to confuse her and destroy all her hopes, leaving her alone with doubts and pain. The ruler of the empire took a deep breath, realizing that a conspiracy had been planned right under his nose that he had not noticed. And this came as a serious shock to him that he could no longer ignore, realizing that the consequences would be unpredictable. The Marquise, with cold wariness, barely audibly uttered the emperor's name, calling him Eustace, trying to squeeze out at least some advantage in this tense moment, as if trying to test how much control she could still have over the situation. With a cold and expressionless look, with an emotionless tone, the ruler said that he left the lady in surprise only because he did not want to dirty his hands on her, and if the noblewoman really heard him, then she should take the children and leave here immediately, without wasting time on unnecessary conversations. The woman, realizing the gravity of the situation, closed her eyes and remained silent, as if her inner fear of possible punishment had paralyzed her, turning her into a mute and motionless figure, not daring to even move or say a word, so as not to worsen her situation. The Marquise's family, realizing the seriousness of what was happening, bowed respectfully and left the hall in deep silence, not daring to say a word, since they understood that any word would only worsen their situation and bring down upon them even greater wrath of the ruler. Philomel watched them, feeling her gaze pierce their backs, because ever since they had dared to defile the imperial family, they had become true outcasts, and no one could forgive them for this impudent act, which had cast them into disfavor and doomed them to contempt. Her father stood next to her, silent and cold, and this made Philomel afraid, not understanding what exactly his silence meant, thinking that he was perhaps angry with her for something, although she could not understand why exactly he was so upset. But the anxiety did not go away. Suddenly, Eustace spoke, addressing the girl, saying that they should both go and move away a little, instead of standing in one place, and his words seemed to make her heart beat faster, pushing her to decisive action, because she understood that a lot depended on her decision. Without thinking twice, the girl quickly rushed after her father, agreeing with his proposal, feeling how her anxiety was gradually fading and was replaced by a feeling of confusion and uncertainty. But she could no longer retreat, feeling that now she needed to move forward. Walking behind her dad, Philomel began to talk about her classes, teachers, and grades, trying to ease the tension she felt, because talking to him always gave her a feeling of closeness, even though she knew that words could not distract her from her worries. The end of the day was soon approaching, and the sky was turning scarlet and pink, giving the impression that the whole world was immersed in the soft and warm atmosphere of sunset, while her heart continued to fill with anxiety, because the day was full of events that she could not forget. Eustace, who was walking next to his daughter, suddenly raised his head, noticing how it was getting dark, and said that it was getting colder and colder, and the wind brought with it a coolness, making one feel the approach of night and a change in the atmosphere, which only added shadow to his thoughtful look. Philomel, slightly bowing her head, looked at her father and quietly asked the emperor if he had not enjoyed their walk, her voice sounding slightly puzzled and confused, because she could not understand why he was so silent and detached from her words. The man furrowed his brow and said that he didn't really enjoy spending time walking, but sometimes he really had to go out to find traitors among the aristocrats, because that was part of his duties. Suddenly, Eustace froze when he heard his daughter say that she sometimes went for walks with him alone, and his face became serious for a moment, as if he was trying to comprehend what she meant, wondering if she really wanted to spend time with him. He wondered, surprised, whether he really wanted her to continue walking with him, and Philomel, noticing his confusion, responded enthusiastically that yes, she did enjoy spending time in his company, despite the possible boredom of the walks. The girl firmly continued to say that it did not matter to her if the walks could be boring, because it was much more important for her to be next to him, to feel every word, every movement, to enjoy the company and to appreciate the moments spent together like never before. The emperor remained silent, thoughtful, his hand on his chin, deep in thought, as if trying to figure out what was the right thing to do, trying to sort out his feelings and thoughts that suddenly filled his mind, not knowing what to answer. Philomel, noticing that the silence was protracted, suddenly felt her heart contract with anxiety and fear that perhaps the noblewoman had said something wrong, that her words had not reached his heart, but had merely broken the silence that had fallen upon them both. And now she stood in complete uncertainty. Finally, after much deliberation, Eustace agreed to take her for walks from time to time, and the little girl, full of happiness and gratitude, cried out joyfully, radiating such energy and delight that the air around was filled with fun and slight excitement. However, she suddenly slowed down, feeling her father's surprised and quiet gaze on her, which seemed to penetrate into the very depths of her soul, causing her slight confusion and awkwardness, as if time had stood still and the world around her had become motionless. Philomel coughed, feeling the embarrassment growing on her, and not knowing how to properly react to this situation. She shyly turned away, trying to avoid the piercing gaze of her father, who seemed to see her even when she tried to hide. After which, like a true lady, she made a smooth and graceful curtsy, expressing gratitude to the emperor for fulfilling her request with such noble kindness and attention, filling her heart with a feeling of deep respect and gratitude. The ruler of the empire looked at her intently, his gaze silent but full of confusion, as if he was trying to understand her actions without saying a word. And at that moment, all the silence around her became so heavy that she felt it like a physical pressure, capturing her attention. The little girl raised her eyebrows in surprise at his words about her father asking her to behave as before, and not as an adult as she had become, sensing some bewilderment and confusion in his request, as if he did not understand what had happened, and her behavior had become a mystery to him, which he did not know how to deal with. Without going to explain his words, Eustace turned away calmly and briefly told Philomel to behave as she liked, giving her complete freedom of choice as to how to be in this situation, without unnecessary words and explanations, leaving her in doubts and thoughts about what he really meant. The little girl, still full of bewilderment, repeated his words in surprise, not knowing exactly what he meant and not understanding why her behavior was now causing such contradictory reactions, leaving her at a loss and searching for an answer to this question. Eustace walked away silently, his back hidden by a dark cloak that fluttered behind him, as if reflecting his dark mood, giving his whole appearance an air of mystery and silent determination, as if he were absorbed in his thoughts. Suddenly, as if breaking the silence, the advisor abruptly opened the door, and with him entered the countess, followed by the princess. Their presence in the room seemed to fill the space with an invisible force, giving the moment a special importance and tension that could not go unnoticed. They approached the room where the emperor lay in bed, consumed by the effects of a hangover, his face pale and his eyes dull from the previous day's celebration, which had left him with nothing but heavy memories, anxiety, and vague feelings. Two of the three stopped in the middle of the room, standing between themselves like a barrier, invisibly dividing the space and their gazes, and the others could not help but notice how they began to look at each other, evaluating every gesture and movement, which only increased the atmosphere of tension. The advisor cleared his throat slightly, as if preparing for an important step, ready to soon call upon the ruler of the empire to draw his attention to current events that could not be ignored in the conditions of growing tension and political instability. Eustace started loudly at the sharp cry that rang out in his bed, and immediately woke up, feeling tension grip his body and his heart begin to beat faster from surprise, as if his whole world had suddenly turned upside down, as if a deep peace had been disturbed. The cry, like thunder, resounded throughout the great palace and garden, breaking the silence of the night and proclaiming that morning had come, a new day full of unknown possibilities, and everyone around seemed to feel its power, piercing the air and shaking this world. The ruler of the empire, clutching his head with his hand, tried to get rid of the pain that was growing in his temples, feeling how after yesterday's drinking, his head was breaking from the heaviness and unpleasant memories that firmly filled his consciousness and clouded his mind. Philomel, smiling and slightly bowing her head, approached her father, the emperor, and, carefully leaning on his arms, greeted him, wishing him good morning, as always, trying to melt the icy silence of his heart with her warmth and sincerity, giving him peace. Together with the ruler's advisor, The girl, full of determination, devised a plan to rid the emperor of this destructive habit and intended to do everything possible to get rid of the pernicious influence of drunkenness, which threatened his common sense and the state cause. Now, however, awakened, Eustace looked at them sullenly. His gaze was heavy and tired, as if he was trying to escape from the embrace of a long nightmare. But the reality turned out to be no less cruel and frightening than the dream into which he had just plunged. The man suddenly shuddered when his daughter addressed him, and he bowed his head wearily, feeling how every question and every word of hers awakened in him old pains that he tried to forget. But now they again filled his heart with heaviness and anxiety. Playing modestly with her hands in front of her, Philomel asked, somewhat awkwardly, if Papa could go for a walk with her today, her voice full of hope and childish innocence. But in her eyes there was a shadow of doubt, as if she already knew that the answer might not be like that. The second advisor, standing nearby, firmly stated that the ruler had no plans after dinner and would have free time, leaving behind the hope that the emperor would find the strength and time for his daughter, who was so eagerly awaiting this. The little girl settled down next to her father with hope, confident that he could spend time with her, because she sincerely believed that his love and care could make even the most difficult moments easier, filling them with light, warmth, and indescribable joy. Leaning on the armrest and thinking a little, Eustace suddenly declared that the little girl didn't have to ask, and that he was still ready to take a walk with her before work, because he understood perfectly well how important every moment spent together was for her, even if it was only a few minutes. The garden, dotted with green grass and colorful flowers, looked truly beautiful, as if painted in the heart of spring, when everything around was filled with life and joy from the warm sun, which gently illuminated every corner, giving this moment a special harmony. The father and daughter walked along the road, surrounded by flowering bushes, trees, and plants, enjoying the silence and fresh air, as if every step brought them peace and harmony in this calm but meaningful moment, which was a real gift for both of them. Philomel, satisfied, clenched her hand into a fist, proud that she had managed to convince her father to go for a walk with her, because it was her small but significant success that filled her heart with joy and left a bright smile on her face, giving her confidence and inner happiness. She looked at her father with creamy eyes, and his golden eyes met hers, full of hope and expectation, as if she was looking for confirmation of her importance and value in him, even in the smallest moments, which made her heart flutter. Trying to start a conversation, she suddenly began talking about how her teacher had praised her the day before, saying that she was one of his best students, and her voice was filled with pride in her achievements, although there was still a timidity in it, as if the noblewoman herself could not fully believe these words. The emperor, hearing this, nodded approvingly, and also praised her, to which the little girl, a little embarrassed, stated that she thought she was praised only because she was a princess, and not for something more important, despite her efforts, and honest efforts. Eustace paused, lost in thought for a moment, and, as if pondering every word, finally said that her teacher was certainly not one to flatter, and therefore his daughter had earned praise not for her title, but for her knowledge, work, and perseverance, which had earned her real respect and recognition. Suddenly, the little girl stumbled, and her small steps gave way. She began to fall forward, trying to catch herself, but at that moment her weakness became obvious, and she almost lost her balance, as if she had forgotten her strength. Feeling vulnerable, she stretched her arms out in front of her, preparing for the fall and the impact, her body instinctively trying to find support to somehow soften the blow. But the moment was too fast, and she did not have time to prepare. Feeling how everything was happening very quickly, the little girl winced as her hands met the ground, and a sharp pain shot through her entire body, penetrating every cell, especially when her foot hit a hard surface, causing her to grit her teeth, not allowing herself to show how much it hurt, hiding the pain behind a tense expression. Philomel tried to keep the tears in her eyes, holding back the pain and trying to hide her weakness, because she understood that she couldn't show it to her father. Otherwise, it would make him worry and worry, which was not at all in her plans. But suddenly, at that moment, she heard his quiet question. Was she okay? The girl, with an effort, swaying slightly, rose to her feet, trying to hide her trembling, and, looking at her father with complete determination, stubbornly declared that she was completely fine, despite the fact that her body, which seemed fragile and tense, betrayed the exact opposite. The man listened silently to his daughter's answer, but his gaze, full of doubt and hidden discontent, made it clear that he did not believe her words, because he saw how her body was trembling and felt that she was trying to hide her weakness from him, which was in sharp contrast to her confident phrase. The girl's leg was bright red, like a fire scorch, and was very swollen, causing her acute pain, but she tried to hold on, holding back her clenched teeth and not allowing herself to weaken, although each step brought her more and more fear and various discomfort. Suddenly, like a giant shadow, the emperor suddenly loomed over his daughter, his powerful figure blocking the light, and she, looking up in shock, looked at him in surprise and some fear, unable to understand what exactly her strict father wanted from her at that moment. His gaze was full of hidden intentions. Without wasting a second, the ruler picked up the girl in his arms, realizing that it would be difficult for her to move on, and with care, he held her tightly to himself, trying to minimize her pain, ease her path, and ensure her safety so that she would not fall from fatigue. Young Philomel, frightened by what was happening and not understanding what exactly was happening, screamed loudly, asking in panic what exactly the emperor was doing now, because the noblewoman could not understand his intentions and actions in this strange and frightening situation. The adult Eustace, noticing her panic, calmly and confidently, told her not to twitch or try to escape from his arms, assuring her that her safety was his top priority at that moment, and he would not allow anything bad or dangerous to happen to her. After that, he carefully carried her over his shoulder like a sack of potatoes, ignoring her indignation and protests, and with full determination walked forward, carrying her to a safe place where she could regain her strength, calm down, and come to her senses a little. The guy's gaze was emotionless and calm, like a man who seemed to not know how to properly handle children, but at the same time, he handled the situation confidently and calmly, not allowing himself any doubts or hesitation in his actions, as if everything that was happening was part of his usual world. Later, he changed his grip and now carried the sweet girl in front of him, holding her in a more comfortable position, and, a little hesitantly, she thanked him, quietly saying, "Thank you," trying to somehow ease this burden for him and not cause unnecessary inconvenience. The man, noticing her gratitude, gently explained to his daughter that only members of the imperial family were allowed to enter this garden, and only they had the right to be here, emphasizing the importance and exclusivity of this place to which they were heading. The grown man confidently denied that the young girl could weigh too much, because she was easy to carry, and he did not feel any discomfort, as he carefully held her in his arms, as if he was ready to bear any weight for her safety. The little girl was a little nervous. Her big eyes tried to look for her father's gaze from time to time, but she did not try to break free from his strong hands, feeling how his warmth and strength gave her confidence and security, not allowing her to worry about what was happening. They moved through an incredibly beautiful garden, surrounded by majestic columns and green corridors, where every step was filled with the magic of silence and tranquility, and the air was filled with the scent of flowers and a light, cool breeze, creating a feeling of peaceful calm. Over time, the baby began to blink slowly, her eyes losing focus, and as if she was plunging into a dream world, she almost fell asleep, allowing herself to surrender to the warm drowsiness that came from her father's safe embrace. And everything around her seemed incredibly cozy. Philomel herself did not notice how she fell asleep in her father's arms while he continued to carry her, and, plunging into sleep, she felt her body relax and her thoughts dissolve in the peace that his strong, caring hands gave her, feeling incredible safety. The girl slept sweetly and peacefully, her eyes closed, as if in an embrace with the warmth of her father, and her heart was filled with an irresistible feeling of security while she serenely indulged in sleep, dissolving in the warmth of his presence and security, forgetting about everything. The ruler of the empire, with a deep calmness on his face, continued to carry the baby in his arms, not feeling tired, and step by step confidently moved forward along the road, despite all the trials that could lie in wait for them along the way, confidently and calmly walking. The huge window, through which the bright sun shone, offered a stunning view, nature illuminated by light, and the endless blue sky, as if inviting them into a world of harmony and peace, where there was no place for worries or fear, only endless peace. The Countess saw the Emperor with her daughter in her arms and told him that the little girl was very tired, as she had been studying and working all the time, without finding time to rest and play, which, of course, affected her well-being. Her mood became more and more depressed. The woman explained with a slight smile that the princess was very worried about her father, so she brought him tea every morning, showing care and attention, to somehow make his day easier and show her love, despite her own fatigue. Awkwardly, a little lost in thought, the lady looked away, as if trying to hide something important, and her face became thoughtful for a moment, as if she was trying to hide her true feelings and thoughts, which the noblewoman did not dare to show to any person. Finally, she spoke, sighing, and as if unable to bear the silence, she confessed that Isabel, too, loved to walk in the garden, enjoying the solitude, and often spent time there, leaving the palace to simply be alone with herself, reflecting on life and finding peace in this silence. The Countess, with a slight sad expression on her face, compared the little girl to her late mother, noting that both of them were like flowers, exuding beauty and joy, and that both strove to bring happiness and joy to their emperor, filling his life with light and warmth. Eustace nodded silently, agreeing with her words, and without saying a single word, he thoughtfully looked out the window, observing the view that opened up before him, feeling a slight sadness in his heart that did not leave him even at that moment, as if he had lost a part of himself again. He missed his wife, who had left his life so early, and sometimes, looking at the landscapes, he felt how she loved to enjoy them, stopping in silence and contemplating the beauty of the world that was now without her presence, carrying her away into memories that he could no longer create. He held Philomel tighter with his arm, as if he wanted to surround her with an even greater level of protection and care, and gently stroked her face, feeling how her small features, reminiscent of his own, caused an indescribable feeling of tenderness and warm excitement in him. The Countess, looking at the Emperor in surprise, froze when he said that the baby looked more like him than like her mother, as if she had only just now realized this similarity. But a moment later, she realized that the ruler was right, and agreed with his observation, finding no more arguments for objection, after which she smiled knowingly, bowing her head slightly in agreement, and nodded, agreeing with the ruler of the empire, as if her words were superfluous, because she had already seen how Philomel really reflected her father's features, which confirmed her words. The window of the old mansion, surrounded by a garden, looked out onto the endless blue sky, pierced by the rays of the sun, and reflected in its glass all the charm of a summer day, filling the room with soft light and creating a feeling of coziness and peace, as if the house itself breathed with nature. Someone's hand, carefully moving in the semi-darkness of the library, slowly reached for an ancient tome that rested on a high shelf of an old cabinet, covered with a patina of time, as if it itself kept countless secrets hidden in the yellowed pages of the book. The little girl, who had just recently turned 10 years old, looked at the book in her fragile hands with a smile, not believing how quickly time had flown by, and feeling the anticipation of a new story that was about to open up before her, taking her thoughts into a world of fantasy and adventure. As soon as she had settled comfortably into the chair by the window, opening the book to the first page, and already preparing to immerse herself in reading, she was suddenly interrupted by a strange voice that sounded in the room, as if tearing her out of her sweet anticipation, forcing her to look around warily. It was Nazar, sitting very close to her, looking thoughtfully out the window, and then, as if casually, asked in a calm voice if the princess hated him, and in these words there was a slight uncertainty, as if he himself was afraid to hear an answer that might not be what he wanted. The little girl tilted her head to the side in surprise and looked at the boy in bewilderment. Her eyes flashed with genuine curiosity, and after blinking several times, she finally asked him who could have told him such nonsense, because such thoughts seemed completely ridiculous and even a little funny to her. Nazar slowly, as if thinking, carefully placed the book on the table. His movements were unhurried and careful, as if he was afraid to disturb the invisible silence that enveloped the room, and at the same time trying to find the right words for what he wanted to say. And then, sighing softly, he sincerely apologized for the conversation long ago when he discussed her with his father, admitting that his opinion was completely different then, but much had changed since then, and now he looked at Philomel differently, realizing how greatly he had been mistaken in his previous judgments. The princess froze for a moment, not knowing what to answer. Her gaze stopped on Nazar's face, and thousands of questions swirled in her thoughts, which were just bursting to get out. But instead, she just silently looked at him, trying to understand the meaning of his words and their true meaning. Suddenly, the boy jumped up from his seat, loudly slapping his palms on the table, and this unexpected sound broke the silence of the room, causing the girl to flinch in surprise. Her eyes widened, and her heart stopped for a moment from the sudden surge of his emotions. To Philomel's great surprise, the young man, without further ado, knelt before her, his gaze full of sincere repentance, and, bowing his head, he humbly asked her forgiveness, as if this act was the only way to ease his soul and express everything that had accumulated in his heart. The girl flushed with surprise, reached out to him in confusion, and, slightly embarrassed, insistently asked him to get up, declaring that all this was complete nonsense and that he shouldn't have done this at all. But, to her surprise, Nazar only shook his head, refusing to get up. However, he still did not raise his head and did not move from the spot. His determination was unshakable. He firmly declared that he would not get up until the princess forgave him completely, and until she was convinced that there was no longer even a shadow of resentment towards him in her heart. The young lady answered briefly, but confidently, that the young man had nothing to apologize for, since his words had not caused her the pain he imagined, and besides, she herself had accidentally overheard their conversation, and if anyone needed to apologize, it was she. But Nazar still didn't calm down, and there was genuine sadness in his eyes as he quietly explained that it wasn't just that. It was hard for him to realize that he had actually hurt her at one time, even if he had done it unknowingly, and now that burden was haunting him. The beauty sighed heavily, realizing that this stubborn man was not going to back down, and although her heart was full of confusion, deep down she admired his persistence, because not every person was ready to so sincerely ask for forgiveness, forgetting about pride and dignity. So they remained in their places. The young lady stood in indecision, not knowing what to do, and in front of her on her knees was the young man, who categorically refused to get up, as if the only important thing for him at that moment was to obtain her forgiveness. That distant day, left in the past, was special for her, and has not yet been erased from her memory, because then the princess, not noticing anything around her, ran as fast as she could along the long corridors of the castle, her heart pounding in her chest with impatience, and her breathing was ragged. At that moment, Philomel was impatient to see her fiancé, whom the noblewoman still barely knew, but whom she so longed to meet, and her maid followed her, barely keeping up, trying to remind her that it was not proper for noble ladies to run around the entire huge palace like that. And then, at the very moment when she turned the corner, her gaze met the eyes of the boy standing in the hall for the first time, and for a moment, everything around her seemed to stop. Philomel involuntarily froze in place, unable to take her eyes off him, because he was so handsome that her heart skipped a beat. At that moment, Nazar and Philomel met each other's eyes, and that moment seemed to freeze in time. The boy was dazzlingly beautiful. His golden hair shimmered softly in the sunlight, his scarlet eyes shone like precious stones, and his flawless smooth skin seemed almost unearthly. The young man, without losing his confidence, smiled affably and greeted the princess with a slight bow of his head. His voice sounded soft, but there was a barely noticeable play in it, as if he already knew that this moment would be fateful for both of them. The young couple stood opposite each other, their eyes riveted on each other, as if the world around them had suddenly disappeared, leaving only the two of them, and between them hung an invisible but tangible tension, filled with unknown feelings and a premonition of something important. The little girl, without hiding her sincere desire, quietly asked the boy to stay a little longer, because she liked him. There was something warm in his gaze, something that made her feel trusting, as if they had known each other much longer than it seemed at first glance. Nazar hesitated a little, then, realizing that his strict father was already waiting, and he should leave with him. But deep down, he himself did not want to leave her so quickly, because there was something special in this meeting that made his heart beat a little faster. Coming closer, the young man leaned towards her and, showing great kindness, with a slight smile on his lips, said that since she asked so, he would stay with her for a little while longer, as if these words contained not only a promise, but also a hidden joy from the prolonged moment of their acquaintance. With a slight blush on her cheeks and a beaming smile, Philomel happily thanked the boy, her eyes shining with genuine joy, because it meant that they still had a few precious moments ahead of them that she already knew would remain in her memory forever. And at that moment, barely aware of what they were doing, they slightly casually, but so naturally extended their hands to each other, their childish fingers touching, intertwining, as if cementing not just a fleeting meeting, but the beginning of a friendship that might become something much more. But then she did not yet know that everything that connected them was only an illusion, fragile as thin glass, and one day this illusion would crack, crumbling into pieces, leaving behind only the bitterness of disappointment and a quiet, inevitable emptiness. Philomel again gently but insistently asked the young man to rise to his feet, assuring him that all this was not his fault, that he was not obliged to repent for feelings that he could not control, because the heart does not obey orders, and this is neither his nor her fault. Her voice was calm, even distant, when she said that they both had no control over their feelings, and if fate had decreed that he could not love her, then she had accepted it, resigned herself to it, learned to live with it, even if deep down it still hurt. Nazar, hearing her words, slowly raised his head. His eyes sparkled with unexpected determination, and he firmly objected that, on the contrary, he was obliged to control his feelings, that a noble man should keep himself in hand, not allow emotions to rule his destiny. Annoyed, but with a slight shadow of a smile, the girl crossed her arms over her chest and sighed heavily, shaking her head, as if not knowing how else to deal with his stubbornness. Yes, he is so unbending, just like a real stubborn person, the likes of which you would have to look for. Looking at him, she suddenly realized that the Duke, his father, had clearly taken great pains to raise his son in the spirit of strict, unshakable principles, and now these principles seemed to have a much greater influence on him than his own desires and feelings, leaving him captive to family traditions. Kneeling down before her again, Nazar continued to argue with the young lady with unwavering persistence, not wanting to let go of his position, demanding to understand what exactly it was that she was not happy with, why she accepted their separation so calmly, as if this loss had no significance in their lives. The little girl looked at the boy with wide eyes, surprised, and he, without hesitation, directly explained that he was initially assigned to her not just as a friend or a fiancé, but as a person obliged to serve her, protect her, and take care of her until the very end. Outraged by his words, the beauty flushed, her face turned red with indignation, and, unable to contain her emotions, she screamed sharply, demanding that the boy immediately stop talking such ridiculous nonsense, because no one could force him to take care of her if he himself did not want to. Like a guilty puppy, Nazar sat on the floor, his head hanging guiltily, and quietly admitted that his father had personally assured him that his destiny was to be near the princess, to look after her, to support her, and in the future to become her mate, because that was their agreement. Resolutely, without a shadow of doubt in her voice, Philomel took a step forward, straightened up proudly, and, looking at the young man with an unexpected firmness in her eyes, calmly but insistently asked him to come closer to her, as if she was ready to say something truly important. Gently, with tenderness in her movements, she carefully took his hand, her fingers warm and light as a feather, and gently pulled him up, helping him rise from the cold stone floor, as if she wanted to show that he was worthy of standing next to her and not bowing before her. After Nazar, still a little confused, sat down on the chair. Philomel, with unperturbed confidence in her voice, calmly but firmly ordered him to repeat her words after her, not giving him the opportunity to evade or refuse, for she wanted him to realize their true meaning for himself. After Philomel had brought her face close to his, she began to speak quietly and persistently in such words as would convince him that he was indeed a valuable person, worthy of having his own opinion and the right to express it. The young man froze, slightly embarrassed. His breathing became ragged for a second, and it took him a few moments to decide to say these words, which seemed to be stuck in his throat, because they contradicted everything he had been taught since childhood. He sat on the chair, listening intently as she spoke the words in front of him, her voice sounding with confident clarity, and his gaze followed her every movement intently, as if trying to catch every detail, every word she spoke. Then the princess, clutching her heart, resolutely declared that every person has every right to live the way they want, to follow their desires and inner convictions, without fear of condemnation from others. The handsome boy's eyes flashed a bright red light, and a blush of embarrassment colored his cheeks, giving his face an expression full of excitement and confusion, as if the storm of emotions inside him could no longer remain hidden, spilling out, illuminating everything around. He clenched his hands into fists on his knees, tense with excitement, feeling how every movement of his became filled with internal energy, as if he was ready to break out of himself and finally declare his desires, confidently and decisively showing the whole world his right to freedom. Then, having overcome all doubts and inner torments, he, with complete confidence and determination, declared that he would live the way he wanted, not paying attention to other people's views and opinions, following exclusively his inner convictions and aspirations, not allowing anyone to dictate terms. At this point, they both decided that they would no longer listen to other people's advice and instructions, but instead would keep their promises to follow their own paths, full of hopes and aspirations, without allowing the influence of outsiders to interfere in their lives. The young man looked at the princess with a smile and thanked her for her concern, feeling his heart fill with warmth from her care and support, which was so important to him at this moment in their lives, giving him a sense of security and confidence in his actions. Soon, a gentle evening came, and outside the windows, one could see the pink sky, colored by the sunset, creating an atmosphere of quiet comfort and peace, as if everything around had frozen in silence, absorbed by the last rays of the day, which gently touched the horizon. On the dinner table, there were many plates full of various delicacies, fresh salads, tender meats, exquisite dishes, each of which promised not only satiety, but also the enjoyment of exquisite tastes, filling the air with appetizing aromas. Waving her hand to the side, the princess suddenly asked the boy how he saw his future, but not what his father had imposed on him, but what he himself would like to achieve, following his own dreams and aspirations, opening up new horizons and opportunities for himself. Rubbing his neck in embarrassment, Nazar admitted that he was ashamed to talk about it, but despite everything, he dreamed of becoming a knight instead of an aristocrat, dedicating his life to honor and service when he grew up, protecting the weak and justice. The sweet girl supported her interlocutor in his new endeavors, smiling and saying that it was a really good plan, worthy of respect, because everyone should strive for what is truly close to them and important to their heart, regardless of external pressure. She listened to him with a smile, feeling the joy that in the future they would have a good relationship, even if it was as friends and not lovers. But it was still important, because connections are valued much more, and their friendship could become that very strong foundation on which their future would be built. Soon the sky turned dark blue, and the stars began to twinkle, filling the night with a mysterious light that created a sense of peace and completion of the day, absorbing everything around into the silence of the night, immersing the world in an atmosphere of magical nebula, as if time stood still. Nazar went out into the street and said goodbye to the princess, looking at her with a little regret as he left, and then headed towards the carriage that was already waiting for him, ready to take him to a place where other worries, duties, and unfinished business awaited him, which were so far separating him from this cozy moment. Surprised, the young man flinched when the lady noticed with a smile that he apparently wanted to tell her something, and, seeing through him with a slight mockery, she gently joked, making him feel a little awkward from the fact that he was unable to hide his thoughts and emotions, as if she had perceptively seen his inner world. Sternly, but with concern in her voice, young Philomel ordered her interlocutor to always tell her what he really wanted to say, and to stop listening to his father's instructions, because only in this way could he become himself and follow his own path, without unnecessary doubts. The guy, somewhat embarrassed but determined, answered her that he would try and would definitely listen to her words, realizing that this advice was important to him and could influence his future, allowing him to be honest with himself and move towards his goals, not forgetting about inner harmony. After which, Philomel folded her arms across her chest, looked intently at Nazar, and, with a slight threat in her voice, said that if he continued to talk nonsense, then he should definitely tell her, and she would definitely explain to his father how unwise it was to behave in such a way with his son. The boy, slightly shocked, began to laugh, thinking that it was just a joke, but the princess, noticing his reaction, became angry and her face became serious, realizing that her words were not taken quite as she expected, which only increased her irritation and made her press her lips tighter. With a blush on his cheeks, Nazar covered his mouth with his hand, apologizing for his reaction. But despite his embarrassment, he accepted the lady's promise, because the noblewoman was so sweet and caring that he could not help but feel grateful for her willingness to support him in difficult moments. The princess watched him with surprise, watching him disappear into the darkness of the night, and the moon, like a silent and mysterious witness of their farewell, illuminated his figure, giving everything that was happening an atmosphere of deep thoughtfulness and inexpressible loneliness. And after that, smiling slightly, she realized that their relationship had really improved, as if every look, every word became more sincere and open, creating an invisible but strong connection between them that made her heart beat faster. The fire in the fireplace burned brightly, its flames dancing in the air, casting wavering shadows on the walls, while the warm glow of the fire filled the room with coziness and silence, as if the atmosphere itself became an integral part of their tranquility. Finally, the lady, focusing her attention on the book that lay before the sweet noblewoman, studied its pages with attention and caution, trying to understand the future and its complex turns, knowing that every word revealed an important detail of what was inevitably to happen. Then, without a moment's hesitation, she stood up and, with determination in her voice, walked towards the fire, deciding that it was time to get rid of this book by throwing it into the flames, hoping that her action would not cause anything unusual or dangerous, and that everything would remain within the usual course of events. The little girl threw the novel into the fireplace with a running start, not thinking about the consequences, trusting the moment and her intuition, as if this was the only way to cope with her inner doubts and free herself from the heaviness she carried within herself. Slowly but inexorably, the fire began to consume the pages and cover of the book, leaving behind only dark, crumpled remains that dissolved in the flames with each passing second, as if forever taking with them its secrets and the past that it hid. Covering one eye, the princess watched the process with tension, feeling how the excitement grew, intertwined with slight fear, because with each moment the book lost its outlines, its pages became more and more unrecognizable, and its secrets disappeared without a trace in the flames. The novel burned to the ground, leaving behind only sparkling embers and smoldering remains, as if the book itself had dissolved in the flames, taking with it all its secrets, hidden stories, and words that would now forever remain in the past, never to be revealed. Relieved that her secret remained intact, Philomel wiped the sweat from her forehead, feeling the tension fading with each passing moment, her soul finally finding the peace it had longed for, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from her, even if only for a brief moment. As soon as she felt a strange, almost imperceptible cold, suddenly a mysterious golden seal appeared on the floor right under her feet, and at that moment her body was seized by a strong shock. She could not believe what was happening before her eyes, and instantly froze in complete bewilderment. The beautiful girl frowned with some bewilderment, trying to comprehend what was happening, because something like this was absolutely impossible, did not fit into her mind, and it seemed to her that all reality around her began to collapse, as if there were no laws of logic. Next to her lay a new version of the very book that had recorded her entire life and future, completely intact, as if untouched by time, as if it had just come off the printing press, and this book was exactly the same as the one she had once held in her hands. She took the cup of tea from the dish, lifting it gently to feel the warmth that seemed to calm her troubled thoughts and bring back some sense of normality in this absurd moment when everything around her seemed unreal. Philomel thanked them when they poured her tea, and her face lit up with a surprisingly lively expression, as if life itself had returned to her heart, and the world filled with worries had become a little more understandable, and she felt relief in the midst of all this tense atmosphere. Before her sat a magician, important and respected at court, the chief of whom was a man named Humphrey, blond, handsome, and reserved, but his eyes reflected obvious interest when he asked for what purpose the princess had called him. The little girl did not miss the opportunity, and, looking at him with interest, asked how well the man understood magic. He, without losing his smile, answered that he still had a lot to learn, and in this area there would always be room for new discoveries and vast experience. Then, a little nervously, he placed his hand on his chest, as if to confirm his words, and proudly declared that he was one of the best students in the Imperial Magic School, although he knew that there was still a long way ahead, full of new knowledge and opportunities for growth. This delighted the princess, and, unable to contain her emotions, she exclaimed, her voice sounding filled with joy and surprise, as if she had just discovered something incredibly wonderful and amazing that was capable of turning her whole world upside down. Inspired, the beauty, as if forgetting about everything, began to enthusiastically talk about the magic that she had once heard about. Magic that could turn a flower into a carriage or reduce its size to the size of a person, opening up new horizons of magic before her. The court magician, thinking, instantly realized that in principle this was possible, if we take into account the theory of reconstruction of existence, because such magic could manipulate the very essence of reality, changing it at the molecular level. After this, the princess, after thinking for a moment, noted that it was unlikely that any of them would be able to use such spells in the future, since it would require enormous effort, knowledge, and conditions that would hardly be available to them in the near future. So they started talking about the Book of Prophecies, how its ancient writings could predict the future, and how this book could be the key to solving many of the mysteries that troubled their hearts and minds, leaving questions unanswered. Smiling happily, the young beauty trembled as she told about the books that supposedly predicted the future, and with lively interest asked the wizard if this was true or just fiction, because she had always been attracted by this mysterious magic of predictions and prophecies. The cup of tea placed on the table swayed slightly, creating small circles on the surface, as if the room itself felt this extraordinary atmosphere, filled with secret knowledge, magical promises, and anticipation of something incredible. In reality, few magicians saw such novels, books of prophecies, since it was extremely rare, almost impossible, and was considered something mythological, unimaginable for most wizards, who could only dream of such ancient manuscripts. The sweet little girl asked in surprise why this was so, why no one had seen these books, her eyes filled with involuntary curiosity and burning interest, because it seemed to her that this magic should be available to everyone who truly strives to comprehend it. Humphrey began to explain that seeing the future was one of many rituals that magicians performed to try to predict major events, but such practices were extremely dangerous and required deep knowledge and powerful power to work such spells. The young princess ran her fingers over the porcelain cup, as if thinking about something important, and, feeling a strange uneasiness, asked a question about the priests, wondering what role they played in these mysterious prophecies that so occupied her. The magician spread his arms out to the sides, as if trying to find the right words, and explained that the future often changed, and therefore it was extremely difficult to see it with accuracy, and the priests did not engage in predictions, because it was beyond their great power and understanding, and their tasks were different. Sitting at the table, The man quickly began to justify himself, hurrying to clarify that he had not said at all that God does not exist. It was just that, according to him, this issue had its own peculiarities, and not everything was as simple as it seemed at first glance, and much depended on how you perceive the world and its laws. The little girl stood there awkwardly, her breath catching at his words, and she suddenly realized that the mage actually believed that the books of prophecy didn't exist, or if they did, they were just fakes created to deceive or manipulate, leaving her confused and at a loss. When the little girl, with curiosity and naivety, asked what would happen if an outstanding magician decided to perform a divination ritual, the young man froze, not knowing how to correctly answer such an important and serious question, feeling how he was overcome by confusion and awkwardness. Standing awkwardly, he couldn't believe his ears when he heard the girl ask with childish sincerity if even the Lord of the Tower himself could perform this mysterious ritual. And he suddenly realized how difficult it was for him to answer such a difficult question, especially if it was only possible for a select few. His entire soul was in confusion, and he wondered how this little girl could know about the existence of the Lord of the Mage Tower and his key role in the magical world, because this information was hidden from most and was a secret to most mages. With difficulty containing his excitement, he could not help but notice how the princess, again with determination and insistence, repeated her question, as if she was already sure that this ritual was available and that he should answer it, which only added to his nervousness and uncertainty. The young man began to act strangely, answering evasively and confusingly, claiming that this man was not just strange, but a true master of deception and illusion, hiding something incredibly dangerous and mysterious behind his mask, as if he was hiding the very essence of the threat. When the lady fixed her gaze on the man, he suddenly jumped up from his seat and, as if in panic, ran away headlong. The man's reaction was so unexpected and unpredictable that those around him did not have time to understand what exactly caused such an act and why he ran away so suddenly. The noblewoman tilted her head in confusion, not understanding what had just happened and feeling like something was missing. Perhaps she felt like she had missed something important, or her mind couldn't grasp all the subtleties of what was happening, as if something was hidden. The Book of Prophecies, like a silent witness, was suddenly thrown onto the bed, making a loud sound that echoed throughout the empty room, leaving a sense of anxiety in the air, of unknown paths, and dark possibilities opening up before her. The tired princess fell onto her bed with a loud sigh, then sat up irritably, feeling fatigue descend upon her like a heavy cloud. This day had brought her nothing new, and it seemed to her that she had reached a dead end, without making the slightest progress. She couldn't help but grumble that all the other wizards, as if by agreement, refused to tell her about the mysterious Tower of the Magicians and the mysteries of the magic of the future, as if they were deliberately hiding something important that could help her uncover all the hidden mysteries and comprehend the ancient arts of magic. With difficulty, she rose from her bed, grabbed her book, and clutched it tightly in her hands, deciding that, no matter what, she had to find out at least something about the Lord who ruled the Tower of Magicians, about the powerful and sinister creature hiding behind that name. She quickly opened the pages of the book and began to leaf through them, stopping at one of them, which had an image of a magician in a dark robe. Next to the picture, there was a mysterious text, and the princess, without taking her eyes off, tried to understand what exactly it could hide. The girl began to read with interest about the great magician, whose name was connected with the history of magic itself, and with every word she felt a new, exciting world opening up to her, in which magic was not just a force, but a part of destiny. Her biological father, mysterious and majestic, in his long cloak and with a staff in his hand, became one of the most powerful magicians, whose image was an integral part of these stories, full of mysticism and secrets hidden behind every word. As it was said in the novel, the false princess, having escaped one day, decided to go to the mysterious tower to find refuge there and hide from those who were trying to catch her, hiding her true identity and past. And so the owner of this dark and mysterious place turned out to be her own father, the Lord of Magicians, who, despite his virtuous mask, hid behind it dark secrets and mysterious intentions, full of magical conspiracies and intrigues. But then the villain from the book, having lost the rest of her sanity, became consumed by the desire to gain absolute power, and even her own father, who was once ready to protect her, stopped supporting her, realizing that she had crossed the line beyond which there was no turning back. The head of the beauty in the portrait, with her neck cruelly and mercilessly cut, became a symbol of her tragic end, emphasizing the moment when her fate was finally decided, and no force could bring her back to life.